Li Han had not planned to connect his life with studies again, but fate, as usual, had other plans. Together with the old knight, they reached the walls of the greatest magical academy. John excitedly repeated how proud he was to serve Li Han, and how glad he was that he would be studying at such a venerable academy. Li Han mentally returned to the past, to the last hours of his life, when he celebrated graduation from graduate school. Together with a friend, they recalled the journey, sleepless nights, stern professors, and days when they ate only kimbap. The friend admired Li Han's resilience, his persistence despite fatigue, and convinced him to continue his studies. But Li Han then decided firmly, enough. No more studying. He wanted to live for himself and finally start enjoying life. Unfortunately, at that moment, he was hit by a truck with failed brakes. All the efforts and hopes of that life turned to dust in one moment. But now he was given a new life, with memories of the past and a determination not to repeat the same mistakes. He was reborn, and this filled him with joy. Now, as the third son of a magical family, he would choose his own path to his dream. However, the reality turned out to be much harsher. All the power and heritage of the family passed to the firstborn, while the rest were left to forge their own destiny. In his new life, Li Han decided to give up books and become a magician. He told John about this during one of his fencing training sessions. John was deeply touched by the young gentleman's mature thoughts and was sincerely happy for him. Mages were needed everywhere, from the palace to the guilds, and the academy they arrived at was considered the best of all. Li Han hoped to hold out for at least a couple of years, but John believed that studying would be easy. The patriarch himself recognized a rare talent in him. Li Han only chuckled at this. After all, it was the patriarch who forbade him from practicing, saying that he was still too young. With these thoughts, John left his master. From now on, the way inside was open only to students. However, this did not stop the rest of the nobles at all. They showed up with entire retinues of escorts, as if they were arriving for a parade. Li Han looked around in confusion, not knowing where to go, until he noticed a young man behind him, nervously muttering under his breath. When Li Han asked if everything was okay, he heard complaints about life without servants. It became awkward, and he regretted speaking up. Having failed to gain sympathy, the young man went to the representative of the academy, hoping to resolve everything with the help of the family status. But the magician didn't even listen to him. He immediately cast a spell on him that affected the mind. At that moment, Li Han realized the rumors about the academy could be true. Here, you will have to not just study, but survive among monsters. At that moment, the gates of the academy swung open, pouring out emerald light, and the voice of a being was heard greeting the newcomers. The space thickened. The magical pressure emanating from the director turned out to be stronger than any rumors that were circulating about him. A stream of power burst out of the gate like a gust of wind, reminding everyone that magic reigned here, and the weak could not survive in this place. The director seemed to be in a bad mood. With a wave of his hand, he opened a funnel in the sky, which mercilessly sucked in all the unnecessary people, servants, horses, and carriages. Now the mage's wrath fell upon the students themselves. His voice, filled with power, sounded menacing, calling for the students to come inside. After which, without wasting any time, he ordered the rest to go inside. And only then did Li Han notice that a giant skull was hanging above the academy building, glowing with the same green light as the gate. Thus began his first day at the greatest academy of magic. But something inside told him that this path would not be easy. Everyone went inside. Some students were already starting to get indignant. How dare they call them? The nobles, ironheads. Suddenly, a soft, almost musical voice called out to Li Han. The girl introduced herself as Yona Macon. Her family, like Li-han's, came from a family of magicians. When asked what she wanted, she said that the prince wanted to see him. Turning his head in the indicated direction, Li-han noticed a young man actively waving his hand at him. He was slightly confused by such a rapid turn of events, but was already thinking about how he would address him. After all, even in the imperial family, attention is paid only to the firstborn, while the other children don't have such a sweet life. And even though he is a prince, his position among the aristocracy is precarious. Even imperial blood does not always stand at the top. Yona's behavior confused Li-han. He did not understand why she was helping him. The whispers behind his back said he was not alone in this confusion. Still, he decided that it was better to accept the invitation than to immediately make enemies. Yona smiled brightly and shook Li-han's hand. She was genuinely happy. He was the first one to agree. This slightly threw Li-han off balance, but the girl had already managed to rush to the prince to share the good news. Gabriel introduced himself as the 97th prince of the empire, or so he claimed. Despite his nobility, the prince was still very young. As soon as Li-han approached, he immediately began to complain about those who had refused him. Li-han cautiously suggested that perhaps the man simply did not know who was in front of him. This thought noticeably flattered the prince's pride. However, Gabriel was still bothered by the fact that the guy who had rejected him was now having a nice conversation with Adele. Adele was also the daughter of an emperor, but she was born much earlier than Gabriel. She was only the 44th princess. Li-han immediately understood why they were drawn to her. Grace, manners, posture, everything betrayed noble origin. The contrast with his brother was striking. Gabriel decided to teach Adele a lesson through Li-han, who was handsome and stately. But Li-han immediately refused to participate in this venture. Gabriel pondered his next steps, and Li-han advised either to forgive or challenge him to a duel if the offense was strong. The prince did not like this idea, and he announced with an air of importance that he would act as a prince should and forgive everyone. Yona admitted that Li-han was able to discipline Gabriel when she couldn't. He wanted to understand why she cared about the prince. But he was interrupted by a huge skull that suddenly appeared in the hall. A buzz immediately arose in the hall. Someone even recognized it as the very same skull that was hovering above the gate. It was a lich, a terrifying mage who became undead in an effort to defeat death at the cost of suffering and self-denial. Leech didn't speak for long. He asked the students one question. Why did he call them Ironheads? Adele stepped forward. She made her guess. Perhaps because the symbol of the first years this year was iron. The Lich looked pleased and promised to give 10 points to Adele's faculty, who immediately asked about the points system. In response, the Lich only laughed. A true magician must be able to distinguish lies from truth. Adele's answer was correct. The symbol of the newcomers was iron, a durable material for creating things. Lich praised the students, but then he burst out laughing. Yes, iron is suitable for first-year students because their heads are empty. The hall was filled with surprise and awkwardness. The director's speech clearly shocked the students, but no one dared to contradict him, even despite the humiliation. The waves of fog surrounding them were so heavy that it was difficult to move, and sometimes even breathe. Li-han calmly rolled his shoulder, warming up. He had been under this kind of pressure before, and had long since gotten used to it. Seeing this, the Lich still softened the pressure. Not too much, but enough so that the students could breathe. However, when he noticed Li-han, who was moving freely in the thick fog, he was slightly taken aback. The young man had clearly attracted his attention. After thinking for a bit, the Lich ordered to head towards the open door. Behind it was a dining room. High vaults, stone walls, the glow of magic. Everything looked majestic. The tables were laden with treats, The skull wished everyone to rest and enjoy the meal after the tiring journey. The students rushed enthusiastically to the tables. Before them stood delicacies: warm white bread, chicken in wine, casserole with bechamel sauce, and fresh fish fried over coals. In anticipation, they reached for the utensils. But at that moment, the food evaporated into thin air. The director laughed. He was clearly enjoying the way the newbies fell for the same trick over and over again. Lihan remembered that everyone who became a lich lost something important. He was sure that the director had also had to sacrifice a lot. The lich did not calm down. He believed that the best stimulus for a mage to grow was hunger. Clothes and loaves of bread immediately appeared in the air. The students were confused, not understanding what was happening. The answer was not long in coming. It was their uniform and their food. Gabriel tried to protest, but the lich was only flattered. He had been expecting exactly this reaction. He said students should make things happen for themselves. Want delicious food? Make it. Want clothes? Make them. Such were the laws of the academy. Here, everything, power, food, prestige, is obtained by magic, and only by magic. One student suggested going outside the academy to get what he needed, but the lich foresaw this and got ahead of him. Skull explained that freshmen were not allowed to leave the academy and ask older students for help. With this, the director said goodbye to the new students and disappeared into thin air like a mirage. Excellent! Another crazy professor who won't let him live, Lihan grumbled to himself, remembering his past life. The director had the same crazy look as the professor from Lihan's past: obsession and love for the suffering of students. While Lihan was drowning in his own thoughts, Gabriel ran up to him again, complaining about the situation. It was almost impossible for the young prince to accept the idea that he would have to survive on one loaf of bread and worn-out clothes. Lihan realized that the academy was much better than the previous university. At least, they provided food and clothing here. The Lihana family avoided social events, immersing themselves in magic, which made them little known and often misunderstood. It happened again. Lihan muttered under his breath, and Gabriel thought that there was something wrong at home, since he was praising the academy. The academy was famous for accepting talented people regardless of their origin, but the nobles did not want to live with commoners. Therefore, the dormitories were divided into 4 towers. The first tower, the Arrogant Blue Dragon, was for students from noble families. It was there that Lihan was sent. The second, the Phoenix Burning from Within, was for priests of all orders without exception. The third, the Lightning-Rending White Tiger, received the children of knights and representatives of military families. The last one, the Black Turtle, who could see the past and the future, brought together a wide variety of students, from former slaves to newly minted nobles. Because of the low status of its inhabitants, they were often treated with contempt and tried to be ignored. Lihan saw them not just as commoners, but as potential allies and partners, making plans for the future. To carry out the plan, Lihan needed to get closer to the students from Turtle Tower. However, the nobles looked at the commoners with disdain and believed that they should not be allowed into the academy at all. Lihan did not put up with this. He spoke out in defense of the oppressed, reminding the arrogant nobles that here everyone was on equal terms. His words caused awkwardness. Some nobles looked askance at those who humiliated others. This pleased Lihan. It meant he would be able to make the necessary connections faster. But reality immediately hit his pride. Those he had protected became afraid. In panic, they began to move away from him. Rumors began to spread. Some said that the patriarch of his family was a dragon. Others said that they were descendants of ancient spirits. All this seriously alarmed Lihan. He did not expect that his defense would be perceived as a threat. He even decided to ask Yona if he looked scary. She answered without hesitation, "No, not at all. At that moment, Gabriel ran up to them, outraged that he was left alone. Recalling the conversation he had started with Yona, which had been interrupted by the Lich, Lihan wanted to continue it. The conversation was about the prince's mother. Yona was a real tomboy as a child. One day, she broke into an imperial banquet, but running with a drink in her hands was not the best idea. She tripped and spilled the drink right on the empress's dress. Yona was then mortally frightened. Everyone around began to whisper that the Macon family was finished. But, to everyone's surprise, the empress only gently picked up the girl and showed concern. Lihan imagined the empress's kindness, but the truth was simpler. She was simply incredibly rich. The empress paid Yon generously for her friendship with the prince. Hearing this, Lihan decided that it was worth befriending Gabriel. The territory of the academy turned out to be huge. The lake, the forest, the mountains, everything was within the walls. Now Lihan understood that the director was not joking. In order to have something, you need to get it yourself. All the nobles huddled together, trying to find their dormitories. Lihan approached Yona, wanting to understand why everyone had stopped. Looking up, he saw something unimaginable. A stone tower loomed before them. The aristocrats began to be indignant. How is it that they, so noble, should live here? Gabriel did not lag behind. Even his servants lived better. As he crossed the threshold, Lihan felt as if he was being teleported to another space. At first he didn't understand what had happened until a mysterious voice was heard. A voice greeted him and asked where he was going. Then Lihan realized the dormitory at the academy was also magical, and the tower was much larger inside than on the outside. He didn't know where to go and asked the voice about it. He replied that for now only 2 rooms were available to him: his personal room and the Iron Crush room. This answer gave Lihan the idea that other rooms could be opened. After testing his guess, he received an affirmative answer, but with conditions. The voice warned that they could not be opened now. The director had decided so. Although the director was strict, Lihan was not upset and asked the voice to take him to the room. Entering inside, he found a book of rules and began to study it. It turned out that there was freedom of choice of subjects here, except for the compulsory ones. After reading the rules, Lihan realized that everything was not as strict as in his past life. He liked the room. Everything he needed was at hand. But he was the only one who had such thoughts. Other aristocrats were disappointed with their rooms. Having figured out the rules, he decided to ask his new friends what subjects they were going to enroll in. The first person he met was Yona in the break room. She said that she plans to take up alchemy and open her own workshop in the future. Hearing Lihan's praise, Yona was eager to make him her partner, but received an ambiguous answer. Alchemy is not easy. It is a profitable but risky business with high competition. Receiving a counter-question from Yona, Lihan was a little confused. He hadn't thought about the subjects yet. He wanted something simple, because his goal was to become a civil servant. In order not to upset Yeonwoo, he decided to try different subjects. He had a whole month. While they were talking, Gabriel ran up to them with a problem. Without waiting for an answer, the prince shouted that his room had been robbed. The prince still could not come to terms with his new life. The next day, classes began. The first was the mandatory basic course in magic. But the students from Lihan's dormitory looked like zombies. It turned out that the aristocrats, who had grown up in hothouse conditions, could not sleep in the provided beds, and only Lihan got enough sleep. He remembered his past life when there was no time to eat, and he only had to eat energy bars. The colleague who handed him the bar clearly didn't expect such a reaction. Having promised to throw a feast after class, Lihan was excited. But instead of a feast, they were met with kimbap noodles, which upset him. Comparing this with the current conditions, he couldn't help but smile, standing out among his classmates. Finally, the students reached the auditorium. It was good that it was on the first floor. But when they opened the door, they retreated in horror. there was a troll standing inside. These monsters were considered fierce and dangerous. The troll was not embarrassed by their fear, but invited everyone to enter. The students took their seats at the tables, and the troll stood at the lectern. She introduced herself as Garcia Kim, a half-breed who understood their fear, but assured them that there was no need to fear her. Garcia also mentioned that she doesn't eat people, at least not until she's hungry. After these words, the students' fear only increased. They shouldn't catch Garcia's eye when she was hungry. Sensing the tension, Garcia quickly clarified that it was a joke, and not to worry. She began her lecture with a warning. Magic is very dangerous, and few first years have had time to use it. Its purpose is to help students understand their affinity for a particular type of magic and support them on their chosen path. The students were delighted. Not all the professors at the academy were as crazy as the director. "What is magic?" Adele answered, "That magic is the power to change the world at will." Garcia nodded, adding that any changes required mana, magical energy. The first-year students could already recognize it, but they still had to learn to control it. To do this, you need to cast a spell. Some believe that it should be sung, others, spoken. The main thing is the will of the caster. By getting down to practice, Garcia made Lihan happy. He had wanted to start for a long time. While the students concentrated, the teacher guided them, helping them form images in their heads. Yona tried to hold back the flow of mana, feeling like a rider on a wild horse that was about to throw her off. The teacher chose the best moment for the demonstration and summoned a small glowing ball. It was so bright that it blinded the students in the front row. She reminded him that the spell could be any word, but a short one was easier to concentrate. Lihan quickly grasped the essence and began to practice. Concentrating his mana around the stick, it seemed to him that everything was working out. But the mana suddenly went out of control. He wasn't alone. Many of his friends also struggled with concentration. Gabriel was indignant, unable to control his mana, as if it was about to rebel. Luckily, the teacher intervened in time. She explained that uncontrolled magic is dangerous, both for the caster and for those around him. Her job is to prevent this. After being offered the chance to try again, after a while many students stopped trying, giving up completely. In her mind, Garcia knew that although the spell was simple, it would take time to master, but she believed that the students could handle it. After the third attempt, half gave up. After the fourth, only 3 remained. And after the 5th, only 1 stubbornly continued. It turned out to be Lihan, who wondered whether he should continue, since he was left alone. The teacher was surprised. This was already the 7th attempt, and he hadn't run out of steam. First-year students usually don't have such a reserve of mana. Manu was called by different names. In the East, Kui, scientists, ether, priests, divine energy. For beginning magicians, it is common to encounter a lack of it. Garcia was interested in a student without such a problem. Asking him to introduce himself, she was glad that he gave only his first name, without his last name. She invited him to come closer and extended her hand. He placed his palm on hers. As soon as their hands touched, a stream of water began to engulf Garcia. She sank deeper and deeper until she was completely in the water. She was brought back to consciousness by Lihan's voice, asking if she was okay. She brushed it off, saying that everything was fine, but inside she didn't understand what it was. Gabriel thought that Lihan needed help, but Yona told him to shut up. Garcia sent Lihan back to his place, asking him to come see her after class. Continuing with others, she spoke of the small reserve of energy and assured that with practice it would increase. She warned again about being careful with magic, hinting at Gabriel. The lecture ended and Garcia dismissed the students. Lihan entered the professor's spacious office, wondering why she had called him. She admitted that she had heard about him from the director before the lecture. This surprised Lihan. He didn't expect the lich to pay attention to him. Garcia tried to calm the student down, explaining that despite his behavior, the principal was actually kind. No one tells the students about this, But it is the director who informs the professors about newcomers every year. It indicates who should be treated with caution and who should be monitored more closely. As for Li Han, the Lich called him a huge fool. This could be understood both literally and figuratively. There is a saying in the East, "What seems like ignorance may actually be connected with wisdom." Garcia immediately understood the hidden meaning of the director's words and looked forward to meeting Li Han. She had high expectations of him. She didn't tell him this directly, but only said that he had a huge reserve of magical energy. This seriously puzzled Li Han. After all, they wouldn't have invited him for the sake of a little more mana. The teacher, noticing his confusion, explained that he not only had a lot of mana, but there was no end in sight. Even Garcia had no idea where it ended. Mana reserves are an important factor for a mage. If there is little of it, you have to look for ways to replenish it, and a huge reserve frees you from this need. In other words, this is a sign of Li Han's great talent. The news made the young man very happy. It meant an open path to a wonderful future. However, the teacher did not share his enthusiasm. When Li Han asked what she meant, Garcia pulled out a glass of water to demonstrate. A glass is a vessel that helps control the mana inside. Li Han has a whole sea of mana, and it will not be easy to control him. Gradually, he began to understand what the teacher meant. Compared to others, it would be unimaginably difficult for him to manage his mana. This deeply hurt Li Han, and his dreams of a bright future were once again shaken. The teacher took a small bracelet out of the table and handed it to Li Han. It was an artifact that helped control mana. At first, Li Han thought that the bracelet would solve all the problems, but Garcia disappointed him. The bracelet would only help a little. It would not solve the problem completely. In order for the bracelet to work to its maximum, Li Han will need to use a lot of spells, gradually depleting his mana reserves. The teacher even allowed him to practice without supervision, for his own benefit, so that his mana would flow. Leaving the office, Li Han met his friends and headed to his next lesson. He decided to ask them again what subjects they had chosen, because now the task had become more difficult. He wondered whether it was worth taking subjects without magical practice. Yona was still on the path of alchemy. Gabriel heard about it for the first time, but he couldn't help but make a sarcastic remark, saying that only servants practiced alchemy. This seriously angered the girl. She asked Li Han to move away so as not to accidentally touch Gabriel. Then she hit the prince in the stomach with all her might, and he tumbled down the stairs. Li Han learned a lot from his fencing lessons, but Yona's blow was too strong. Leaving Gabriel lying there, Li Han and Yona headed to the basic alchemy lecture. Along the way, they met many students, most from Black Turtle Tower. Li Han didn't care about their origins, but the looks directed at him were frightening. The peasants react to the aristocrats in different ways. Either they run away, or they show hostility. He realized that being friendly would only make their relationship worse. Suddenly, the professor's voice was heard, wanting to make sure that all the students had arrived. He expected to meet another strange professor, like a director or a half-troll. But this time the professor turned out to be an ordinary gnome. His name was Joseph Gomdar. He suggested that the students were wondering why they were gathered in the garden and not in the classroom. Adele stepped forward, declaring that the professor had gathered them to experience the forces of nature, which were important for alchemy. This time the answer was wrong, and Adele blushed with embarrassment. Yona asked Li Han's opinion, which attracted the professor's attention. Li Han's answer made Yona smile, as she thought that collecting materials could not be the main reason. However, the answer turned out to be correct, which pleased the professor. This surprised Li Han himself, because he said it as a joke and did not expect that he would be right. The professor praised him for his sharp mind, but Adele was not happy. Li Han immediately wished that she would not see him as a rival because he himself did not expect the correct answer. The professor began to explain that it was in the garden that students would learn the most important things in alchemy. He continued that many people think that the main thing in alchemy is control of magic and intelligence, but this is far from true. The most important thing turned out to be the collection of resources. He said it with such enthusiasm that it even scared Yanwu a little. Adele felt that collecting resources was a waste of time when they could simply be ordered. There were whispers among the students, many agreeing with the princess, not considering the collection an important part of alchemy. These words made the professor lose his temper. He turned purple with anger. His sharp cries made Adele flinch. She did not expect such a reaction. He loudly complained that she wouldn't be able to grow even a tenth of the necessary ingredients on her own. Even resources purchased from others may turn out to be unusable. This is why alchemists collect herbs themselves. After such an emotional speech, Joseph had to catch his breath. Taking a breath, he emphasized that without understanding the basics of collection, one cannot become a true alchemist. Considering that the explanations were sufficient, the professor suggested moving on to practice. A parchment appeared in the students' hands. It would depict the herb they were supposed to find. Yona and Lihan decided to team up. Lihan was surprised that the defiled herb was used as an antidote. Yona explained that she had the opportunity to work with her before she entered. There were rumors around the school. There were even talks about the death of students, since the academy's territory was fraught with danger. Now they were faced with the question, who to go with? It was scary to be alone. Then Lihan remembered Adele, but Yon thought she was too strict. They decided. While they were discussing, a group of students passed by. At the head of this group was Adele herself, walking gracefully in front and interacting with other students. But something else caught Lihan's attention. There were students from the Black Turtle Tower with her. This upset him. He was avoided by these students, but not her. Yona explained that the princess had always been popular. Even among the imperial family, she stood out for her intelligence, and everyone adored her. Compared to Gabriel, these were two completely different worlds. All the teams quickly went off to complete the task, and the ones left without a team were mostly the students from the Black Turtle Tower. Lihan thought about it. Yes, these students avoided him, but it was dangerous to go together. And then he noticed a girl who was perfect for the role of an ally. It was an elf with dark skin and short white hair. Her name was Nicole. She was a member of the Shadow Patrol, a group of seasoned adventurers from the north. Although this was the first time she had heard of the herb, her enthusiasm was unwavering. The forest didn't scare her. She perceived it as a simple walk and was ready to prove her skills. Yona and Lihan decided to get acquainted. They headed towards her, attracting her attention. The appearance of the nobles surprised her. She did not expect that they would approach her. The boys suggested joining forces and exploring the forest together. This irritated Nicole, who thought they had ulterior motives. She had encountered nobles before, and they always looked at her as if she were a savage. Lihan explained that there could be monsters in the forest and it was safer in a team. But this argument did not convince her. She refused help. Lihan did not back down. He guessed. Nicole thought that she was being used and then abandoned. His guess turned out to be correct, but Nicole still insisted on her own. He continued to convince her, claiming that it was difficult for one to notice the approach of danger. She understood this herself. But the girl just turned away, stubbornly ignoring them. But Lihan continued. Lihan's persistence paid off. Nicole agreed to go with them. This scene puzzled Yuanwu. She didn't expect that Lihan could persuade people like that. Nicole moved through the forest with incredible ease, as if gliding between the trees. She was not only agile, but also fast. Lihan and Yona had difficulty keeping up with her. One thing tormented Yeon. How did Lihan understand that Nicole was an experienced hunter? He shared his observations. The condition of her body betrayed a habit of an active life. Nicole, although she was far away, heard this and was surprised that he guessed from such details. She even suspected that he could read minds. But the wariness disappeared when it turned out that Li-Han simply noticed the Shadow Patrol badge on her belt. He teased her by asking if she had been eavesdropping on their conversation, but all she heard was a confident no. Yona, unable to keep up with the elf, asked her to slow down. Nicole grumbled discontentedly. They themselves asked for help, so let them not complain now. Li-Han sided with Yona. After all, she was the only one who understood herbs, and it wasn't worth overworking her. This made the elf even more angry. She didn't understand why Li-Han was on the team at all. He realized that he was of little use yet, but he did not say it out loud. He took on the role of protector. Nicole noted his build and decided that he was of knightly lineage, but she did not understand the nobleman's robe. Li-Han corrected her, clarifying that he was from the Vardana's house. The mention of this name made a strong impression. Nicole froze in horror. This upset Li-Han. He had hoped that he could get closer to her. Nicole sat in the tree, unable to think of what to say to Li-Han. Once again, he wondered what was wrong with his house. Yona just sighed and replied that House Vardanaz was a special case. Li-Han was intrigued by the rumors. One said that their patriarch was a dragon who had destroyed all the undead during their madness. Another claimed that Vardanaz was blood-bound to ancient spirits, receiving power in exchange for their emotions. The third is that during the riots, they destroyed an entire city. Now it became clear to him why people were afraid even of the pronunciation of his last name. But he still didn't fully understand. Shouldn't magicians help in difficult times? Seeing his reaction, Nicole realized that the rumor about Vardanaz's lack of emotion was stupid. This calmed her down a little. She even threatened to leave if he didn't stop whining. Jumping from branch to branch, Nicole continued to move forward, choosing a better position. Suddenly she noticed something and jumped down to show it to Li-Han and Yone. Pointing to the tracks, she explained that judging by their depth, the beast tried to hide them by controlling its strength. She was overcome with a thirst to find out who left these traces. But seeing Yona's tense face, she realized that she had gotten carried away. This habit certainly didn't help. Such trifles were more interesting to village hunters. But Li-Han's reaction encouraged her. He was genuinely interested in what else she could deduce from the tracks. "Just in case," she asked again, and received a confident yes. This really surprised Nicole. Aristocrats usually didn't show such interest. Without going into explanations, she simply warned, "Such traces are a sign of danger," and immediately jumped up. The creature had left claw marks, and although she wasn't sure of its nature, she guessed it was something large. She heard that due to the excess of mana, all sorts of monsters appeared in the academy. Besides that, there were creatures born from potions and experiments that could wander around here. No one really monitored safety. Nicole suggested following the trail. That way there would be less chance of getting ambushed. Li-Han, inspired by her skills, asked if he too could learn to distinguish tracks. Nicole just chuckled. "It's complicated. He'll probably give up." But Li-Han didn't back down. He believed that she could teach him. She just grinned and wished him luck. They continued their journey deeper into the forest. After a long wandering, they finally managed to find the necessary herb. But luck did not smile on her. Yona found only 2 sprouts, and a third was needed. Turning to her friends, she suggested continuing the search, but they remained silent. Now she understood the reason, and fear gripped her. In front of them stood a huge boar, shrouded in a golden glow. Li-Han felt magical energy emanating from him. It was a monster. The boar prepared to lunge. Li-Han had no weapon, so he took out the only thing that could help, a magic wand. She had a unique property, the ability to change size. Li-Han concentrated and turned it into a spear. Nicole remembered that he was a magician from a great house, and not just a magician, but a representative of the strongest family. What if he really does have an ace up his sleeve? She asked him if he was confident in himself. She never received an answer. In case of failure, she was prepared to distract the monster to give Li-Han and Yona a chance to escape. This act touched both of them. Nicole's face turned red. but she just waved her hand. "I'm still the only one who can do it." Li Han thanked her, not noticing that the boar was already rushing straight towards him. Nicole held her breath. What spell was he going to use? Li Han remembered John's instructions. The sword was good, of course, but you couldn't rely on it alone. John told him about the concept of aura, when a knight fills a weapon with mana, strengthening the blow. Li Han trained as hard as he could, but he understood that aura was only for the chosen few. He didn't strive for it, but he continued to train. He may be a magician, but he has honed his skills in using weapons for self-defense. The old knight was proud that his master was not in the clouds like other nobles, and now these lessons have finally come in handy. Without hesitation, Li Han threw his spear into the monster's open mouth. This shocked Nicole and Yona. They expected a spell, but not such a move. But the technique proved effective. The boar collapsed, unable to even move. The friends were shocked. Li Han defeated the monster with a simple but precise blow. Li Han's wand was sturdy, strong enough to be used as a weapon without fear of breakage. However, defeating the boar with just a wand would have been impossible. His victory was the result of precise mana control. It wasn't an aura yet, but it was something close. Li Han had to adapt on the fly. Nicole pulled the spear out of the fallen monster's mouth, muttering in surprise that he actually did it. Yona, meanwhile, still couldn't believe that the professor had sent the first years to such a dangerous place. But there was no time to think. They were deafened by the loud roar of another boar. No one was happy about such a meeting. Yona even regretted signing up for this class. The guys decided to move towards the sound. It was better to find it first than to be caught off guard. As they approached, they noticed a second boar standing in front of another group of students. Li Han suggested not to interfere for now. There were a lot of students, and perhaps they could handle it themselves. One of the students stepped forward, raising a wand which he transformed into a massive club, just as Li Han had done before. Yona recognized him as a nobleman from the Dalkad family. This family was known as one of the most responsible. If the Li Hans were advisors, then the Dalkads managed the treasury. Li Han immediately recognized his stance. Asen was clearly trained in fencing. Confidently, he declared that he could predict the monster's every move. He jerked to the side of the boar and delivered a precise blow to his side. But the monster did not fall. The blow only angered the beast. Now the boar focused exclusively on him. With a powerful movement, he threw Asen a decent distance away. Having dealt with the first enemy, the boar turned to the rest. Princess Adele stepped forward, shielding the frightened students. Li Han, Nicole, and Yona were still watching. Yona frowned. What should they do next? Li Han was thoughtful. He decided to wait and see. The boar slowly approached the princess. It was obvious that a plan was already forming in her head. She waited. The moment to strike had not yet come. But suddenly the boar howled and reared up. This broke her concentration. She had not expected this and did not know what to do. The boar fell to the ground, dead. Li Han's voice was heard. He was glad that the boar did not notice him. Nicole nodded and explained that he had come from downwind. Clever. Li Han was glad to be learning from her. Approaching Adele, he heard from her a quiet, "Thank you for saving me." As they talked, Nicole watched in surprise at how formally they were communicating. Weren't they classmates? Adele promised to repay for her help, to which Li Han, without wasting time, asked for a favor. The princess narrowed her eyes, not expecting him to immediately find something to ask for. But the request was simple. Li Han wanted a recommendation for a subject in which he could get good grades. Adele thought about it. She was shocked that a representative of House Vardanaz was looking for the easy way out. But Li Han wasn't being disingenuous. He simply sincerely wanted to know. Suddenly, an unfamiliar voice broke the silence. Goosebumps ran down Li Han's spine. The voice said it knew an object that suited him. But the anxiety did not go away. The same one he felt in the past, next to the mad professor. It was Joseph. He approached unnoticed, like a shadow. His eyes were shining. He was eager to get Li-han into his class. Li-han tried to calm down, but he felt tense. He gently made it clear that alchemy might not be his thing. The professor seemed to understand him, and this relaxed him a little. But Joseph wasn't going to back down. He promised to awaken his passion for the subject himself. Behind him, students began to whisper. Now it was clear who would be the favorite. This did not please Li-han at all. Joseph approached the fallen boar, examined it, and then declared the task complete. He lamented that the other groups had not encountered any boars. Asen immediately asked a sharp question. Was this really the goal? The professor nodded. It wasn't just about collecting herbs, but also about the ability to get out of difficult situations. These words made the students angry, but they could do nothing. Yona was especially upset. It turns out that the grass wasn't needed at all. All three were exhausted, dirty, and felt that their efforts had been wasted. But when she said this, the professor was surprised. He did not expect that anyone would cope. Joyfully, Joseph ran up to the trio and hugged them. This once again confirmed Li-han's talent for alchemy. And Li-han, he seemed to have truly begun to accept his fate. Li-han promised the professor that he would try to study his subject, but from the look in the young man's eyes it was clear that he had no desire to do so. Joseph, looking at him, noted to himself, "At his age, students are usually stubborn," but this one calmly agreed. That was why he decided to grant him a privilege, thereby causing a slight suspicion in Li-han's eyes. The professor shared a secret. There was a hut at the very edge of the forest, and now Li-han could visit it at any time until the end of the semester. The young man's thoughts immediately became alarming. He was almost certain that Joseph simply wanted to dump some work on him. The professor cleared his throat and decided to explain. What do first years want most of all? And I immediately got the answer. Food. The aristocrats were obviously not used to canteen food. It was clear from the first day that this could become a problem. Joseph explained that his hut was full of ingredients, spices, vegetables, everything for real cooking. Li-han immediately understood what was going on. Access to proper food. He will be able to eat to his heart's content and no longer have to settle for bread and kimbap. Joy overwhelmed him. He even began to praise the professor, which won him even more sympathy. Later, when all the students had gathered again, there was tension in the air. Some whispered that Joseph was crazy, others that they would no longer come to his classes, and still others were indignant about the boars. Li-han listened to all this and thought that now nothing could surprise him in this school. There was only one thought going through my head. I wanted to get to the hut as quickly as possible. The guys got to her, dragging with them a boar carcass. It could be used to make excellent steaks. The work ahead was not easy. First, cutting. Li-han remembered John's lessons on how to properly process meat, but he couldn't do it alone. To my surprise, Yona volunteered to help, even though she was shaking like a leaf. Li-han looked at her with concern. She looked tired, as if on the verge of a breakdown. Nicole watched them with suspicion. She doubted that these two would succeed. In her experience, aristocrats never worked with their hands. But the determination in her friend's eyes surprised her and even gave her confidence. She joined them, deciding to show off her hunting skills. Nicole and Yona turned out to be a great team. One knew how to hunt, the other knew how to handle materials. The professor brought out a bag with tools suitable for cutting. Armed, the team got down to business. Nicole never ceased to be amazed. She admitted that Li-han had done better than she had expected. Apparently, they taught him that in his house. After cutting, she advised hanging the meat on the branches so that it would not go to waste. Even the intestines weren't thrown away. They were made into sausages. Li-han, despite his fatigue, continued to work. He did not know how long he would live in this school, but he intended to eat normally. While he was smoking the meat, Joseph came up to him and praised him for his ingenuity. Meat spoils quickly, regardless of the weather, so the decision to treat it with smoke was correct. He was surprised how Li Han had learned this in 3 days. But the professor's gastronomic observations were interrupted by the rumbling of his own stomach. Li Han, without wasting a second, politely asked him for bread and some butter. And then he began to fry the meat, generously seasoning it with spices. Joseph brought more food out of the hut, and Yona was happy to note that she would finally be able to eat like a human being. The dinner turned out to be unusually appetizing. The professor even shared some jam. Everyone ate greedily, praising Li Han for his culinary talents. The meat was divine. The third day passed surprisingly calmly and quickly. But the boar was large, and even after smoking there was still a lot of raw meat left. The boys didn't know what to do. They couldn't eat it all, and it was a shame to throw it away. Nicole suggested sharing with friends in the tower. This idea was to their liking, but they took it in their own way. Li Han and Yona came up with an idea to sell meat to the nobles from the Blue Tower. For nobles, buying a piece of meat is not a big deal. Nicole, still not understanding how they turned share into sell, watched silently. She thought that all aristocrats were greedy for money. She didn't understand how they could make money off their own friends. Li Han and Yona offered her to participate as well. But Nicole was determined to just share the meat. No matter how much they tried to convince her that friendship ends faster than a boar cooks, Nicole stood her ground. Joseph, watching them from the side, just shook his head. He was beginning to understand. These three not only had talent, but also the potential to create problems. And it looks like they'll be giving someone else headaches in the future. The Blue Dragon Tower was located deep in the forest, and so the smell of damp leaves always hung in the air around it. But not today. The students of the tower caught a strange, unfamiliar aroma. He brought them to Li Han and Yona, who were preparing meat as if nothing had happened. This scene seriously puzzled the students. They did not understand what these two were doing. Li Han, with a smile, gestured to invite them to the table, offering to try the dish. But everything was not so simple. They had to face an unexpected condition. With the same good-natured smile, he said, "For the food, a silver coin from each." However, the students were only too happy to pay. Normal food was worth any amount of money. Some even shed tears of happiness. They vied with each other in praising Li Han and Yonwoo, grateful for sharing such precious food. Meanwhile, the chefs themselves discussed their earnings and were happy that their idea worked better than any part-time jobs outside the academy. The joy was genuine. The situation had worked out perfectly, and the plan had worked like clockwork. Gabriel, complaining about the noise, went outside. During his training, he had noticeably lost weight. Seeing the crisp, juicy steaks on the table, he felt hunger twist his stomach with renewed vigor. Li Han, noticing his friend, invited him to join with a kind smile. Gabriel was embarrassed that he was apparently allowed to try such an appetizing dish. But the next moment he was sitting at the table, ready to pounce on the food. Li Han didn't even think about giving up his earnings. He even asked a close friend for a silver coin. Gabriel looked at him in amazement. He had no money left after the meeting with the director. Li Han didn't lose his composure and reached into his apron pocket. And he took out from there a loan agreement, asking Gabriel to enter the amount and name. It seemed like he was about to explode with anger. He even started shaking. But in the end, he just burst into tears and quickly filled out the document. Within a minute, Gabriel was wolfing down the meat, thinking to himself how lucky he was to have a friend. Li Han and Yona watched this with interest, happy about another income. The next day, a new challenge awaited the students, a course on the basics of magical symbols. Many were dissatisfied. It seemed that everything was already known, and the subject would seem boring. The self-confidence of some people surprised Li Han. Where did such self-confidence come from? As soon as everyone was seated, the auditorium was filled with a familiar green mist. There was no mistaking that voice. The principal himself had appeared in the classroom. The students refused to believe that he would personally teach the class. This meant one thing: it would not be an easy walk. The principal was surprised to note that the first-year students looked well-fed, something he had not expected. He estimated that it would take them at least a month to get food. One of the students even dared to ask the question, did the director really expect them to feed themselves? In response, the Lich silently cast a spell, silencing the questioner. The thought that they had finally understood his plan gave the director genuine pleasure. Every year the Academy accepted new students, but the Blue Tower was always the slowest to adapt. The first were usually the Turtle and the White Tiger. But the nobles from the Blue Tower were not accustomed to work, and were too proud of themselves to start working right away. This year everything went differently, and it was a pleasant surprise. The director knew very well who exactly stood at the origins of the changes: Li Khan. Feeling the burning gaze on himself, Li Han quickly turned away. He was amazed at his own ability to adapt, especially when compared to the stubbornness of his family. The director always considered flexibility and free thinking to be the main qualities of a magician, so he created difficulties for the students in every possible way. The spell wore off, and the student still asked his question: why is this class needed? In response, he received a counter-question: what, in his opinion, is the purpose of the object? The question left him stunned. It turned out to be simple. The director did not want the emperor to blame him when graduates brought trouble. This answer shocked the students. It turns out they are not here for knowledge, but for reporting. Lich's irritation was growing. The senior courses had already caused him a lot of problems, and this lecture was just a safety net. He suddenly approached the student, frightening him to the point of trembling. Magicians were often considered unpredictable, and it was best not to challenge this opinion. He told the student to open the book and read the rules. The very first rule shocked everyone. Magic should not be used to harm others. The Lich demanded louder. The student began to read, but the book turned out to be strange. The same rule was repeated on all its pages. Skull hoped that this course would help students develop kind hearts. But when he asked for 2 volunteers, none of the students wanted to participate. Li Han knew how dubious this sounded, but since no one volunteered, he began to think about the next step. The director warned, if no one helps, things could only get worse for everyone. Li Han decided that there must be some benefit behind this, and eventually volunteered himself. The Lich moved forward sharply, stopping right in front of Li Han to ensure the sincerity of his intentions. He responded with a polite smile, assuring her that it was an honor for him. However, the director made it clear: he cannot stand lies. Still, he quickly understood why Li Han had volunteered, but he didn't dwell on it. Gabriel was worried about his friend, because no one knew what the director was capable of. One of his classmates stopped him, saying that Li Han was sacrificing himself for the sake of the entire class. This thought alarmed Gabriel even more. He had already decided to follow his friend, but fear gripped him so much that he could not even stand up. And at the moment when he was about to speak about his decision, someone got ahead of him. It was none other than Asan. Leech approved of his candidacy. The Dalcard family was famous for its work with documents. Li Han recognized him. This is the same guy who tried to protect the princess in the forest. He wondered if Asan also wanted some privileges. The young man turned to him, adjusting his glasses. This is how he expressed his intention to repay Li Han for saving him from the boar. Li Han assured that there was no need for this, but Asan simply waved it off. In his family, it was customary to repay debts. Their conversation was interrupted by the Lich. He had a task for volunteers. Papers began to swirl in the air. It looked like something related to them had to be done. Handing over the sheets, the director announced that they must rewrite the safety rules by hand for each student by the next lecture. Sunset was approaching, and Li Han and Asan were still meticulously rewriting the lines. Asan was seething with indignation. He would not forgive the professor for this. He complained furiously. Instead of magic, He forced them to rewrite everything by hand. Li Han was worried. Asen looked like he was about to faint. He believed that the task was not just a punishment, but a way to force them to master magic. But, remembering his first lesson and the failure with the light spell, Li Han realized that he couldn't count on fully recording the text with its help yet. He decided that if the director had been even slightly sane, he would have left them a clue. With this thought, Li Han stood up from his desk and headed towards the teacher's desk, causing Asen to become confused. He explained that he hoped to find a way to make their work easier. Asen was not thrilled. Rummaging through other people's things seemed unacceptable to him. To this, Li Han calmly objected. After all, no one had announced a ban. Having confirmed this, Asen relaxed a little. He no longer perceived it as theft. They split up to look for clues, and, to their surprise, the teacher's desk was almost empty. Suddenly, Li Han's gaze fell on a strange box. It immediately attracted attention. The box glowed green, as if there was something bright inside that was barely contained by the lid. Li Han called Asen over and pointed to the find. They decided to open it. Li Han pulled the handle and the box swung open. The director's skull flew out from there, which scared the boys so much that they fell backwards. Li Han's first thought was that it was an illusion, but the director quickly realized that they had decided to take a shortcut. He even seemed to approve of their choice, although the students themselves were not happy about it. He pointed to the spell inside. It was a simple first-tier manipulation spell, after which he disappeared without saying a word. This attitude angered Asen. He did not understand how one could teach like that. He was fired up with the idea of filing a complaint against the director. If they did it together, he wouldn't have a chance. But Li Han didn't seem to be listening to him. He was absorbed in studying the spell. It was only when Asen approached him directly that he realized how fascinated he was with magic. He calmly noted that a complaint would hardly yield any results, since it was a thankless task to sue madmen. This made Asen think. After some thought, he came to the conclusion that the chance of success was no more than 5%. And instead of complaining, they decided to focus on practice. But no matter how hard they tried, the magic wouldn't work. Asen was completely exhausted. Although magic seemed easy, it was very difficult to control mana. Li Han felt like a clown balancing on a wheel while spinning plates on sticks. He stood up, determined not to give up, and concentrated. It was like those days when the homework deadline was looming. He imagined mana as a smooth stalk of bamboo, light but elastic, directing a dense stream towards the feather. He saw the feather move. The spell worked. The pen was hovering in the air. Now Li Han only had to learn to control it. However, the pen didn't even think of giving in. It whistled past his ear. Having achieved success, he relaxed for a moment, deciding that mana control was no longer necessary. The pen immediately flew out the window, breaking everything in its path and sticking into the wood. Li Han realized that they had two problems to solve before they could use this spell safely. Not only the process of casting itself, but also the control of the object required concentration. Now he realized it. Fortunately, it turned out to be easier than reciting the spell. He decided to try again, this time intending to learn from his past mistakes. While he was concentrating on the handle, the door to the office began to open. The director burst into the auditorium. He declared that practice was enough. He would do the rest with magic. His sudden appearance confused Li Han, and his concentration was immediately broken. The pen began to spin around the room in some kind of furious dance. It eventually landed right on the unsuspecting director's forehead. The students froze in horror, even though it was an accident, hitting the director himself. You can't get away with just a reprimand. While Li Han wondered what would happen to him, Asen, on the contrary, was sincerely happy about what was happening. The director silently clenched the pen in his fist, right next to his forehead. He seemed even pleased. Li Han had succeeded in his spell. He incinerated the feather and rushed past the confused Li Han, who did not expect that he would receive only praise for everything. Considering that the director was in a good mood, he decided to ask for help with checking the subjects. Li-han had just completed the spell, and the professor was not surprised that he was having difficulty. All first years go through this, and upon hearing this, Li-han let out a sigh of relief. But how could we do without a joke? The director lied. The difficulty was not in the control, but in the spell itself. Those who had difficulty with control were considered a special type of mage. This angered Li-han, although he did not show it. His reaction only upset the director. The joke failed, and there was no fun. Realizing this, he turned to a son, deciding to play a joke on him. Raising his translucent hand, he said that with experience, they would come to understand magic. With these words, he teleported them to the dining room and advised them to eat rather than rack their brains. Li-han was in shock. He did not expect the sudden movement. Luckily, he had good reflexes and landed without any consequences. He grumbled, "When they really need magic, there is none. But here, please, teleportation to the dining room." Asen was nowhere to be found. Li-han decided that he had probably been sent to the hospital after suffering from magical exhaustion. The dining room was empty, which is not surprising. Lunchtime was long gone. A portion was waiting for him on the table, 2 kimbap and a loaf of bread. But he was not discouraged. He still had some wild boar meat in stock. While he was enjoying his meal, Adele approached him. Apparently, she was looking for him. The only question was why. Her appearance surprised Li-han a little. He didn't expect to see her here. She took a list out of her robe pocket and handed it to him, saying that this was what he had asked for earlier. Li-han was pleasantly surprised that she had not forgotten his request to recommend items. But, looking at the list, he was taken aback. These were not easy courses at all, but the most popular ones. He didn't expect to see basic alchemy there at all, but he decided that at least something was good. He tried to explain to the princess that this was not quite what he had meant, but she didn't seem to understand what was going on. She thought everything was fine. Then he said it more clearly. It is more difficult to get good grades in popular courses, and he needed unpopular ones. Hearing this, Adele finally understood, but it surprised her greatly. She still doubted that the Vardanazov representative was aiming for easy assessments, but it seemed that was the case. There had been something noble about his actions when he had saved her group. Now she was beginning to doubt her own conclusions. She pulled out another list and handed it to Li-han. This time, it was exactly what he asked for. He was delighted. He wouldn't have to wait any longer, and the objects themselves sounded like things that others would definitely hate. First up was basic fencing. Who would want to learn that at a magic school? The second was practice of magical combat, a course that few people showed interest in. Li-han was pleased. At least he would be able to defend himself better. Having thanked the princess, she immediately left, still wary. The next morning, Li-han headed to his new classes. He invited his friends to go with him, but they refused, not seeing the point. Asen even recommended not to waste time on this. But Li-han understood. No one knows what might happen. He knew that the professors knew that the students had other classes, but they were still bombarded with assignments. That's why he chose easy lectures, to focus on what's important. When he reached the classroom, he was surprised. He was in the basement of the academy. The steps looked normal, but his sixth sense told him that something was wrong here. The magic tower was not a place to be entered thoughtlessly, and everyone knew it. From the outside it looked quite normal, but once inside, you might not find your way out. At least, that's what the story told Li-han as a child said, though even then he considered it an exaggeration. John agreed with him, but with a different subtext. Once you enter the tower, you will not come out, because you will die. Little Li-han was very scared then, but at the same time he was also surprised. The academy was considered the final form of that very magical tower. It was for this reason that the newcomers were in no hurry to explore the building, fearing that they would die if they found themselves in the wrong place. And now, Lihan stood at the entrance to the basement, wondering if everything would be okay with him. While he was trying to calm himself down, the director suddenly appeared behind him. It seemed that Lihan's naive fear amused him. He himself wondered what the lich had forgotten in the basement. But then I remembered that I could use the moment to my advantage. He greeted the professor, flattering him a little. Lihan explained that he would like to go down to the first level of the basement. But since it turned out that way, he would like to ask the professor a question. In response, the skull only waved his hand, saying that he wouldn't be able to tell Likan anything useful, but he would definitely bring a flower to his body tomorrow. Once again, the director got on his nerves, but he didn't show it, so as not to arouse unnecessary interest. Having reached the right door, he felt something ominous emanating from it, hoping to the last that it was just a figment of his imagination. In the corner, he noticed several students chatting quietly. Apparently, they had come to the same lesson. The thought that he wouldn't be the only student in the class made him a little happy. However, after reading the title of the lesson, those students realized they were mistaken and hurried away, leaving Lihan confused. As they left, they discussed how no one in their right mind would choose such an item. The girl even mentioned how the knights from her tower came out scared. After this, Lihan had no choice but to go inside. To his surprise, there were indeed several students in the class. Seeing them, he perked up. Even though there were only 3 of them, that was already a joy. True, they did not look like people who had voluntarily chosen this course. He noticed that there were small spheres lying on each table. Suddenly, a voice was heard in the room. The professor had been sitting in the shadows all this time, in one of the corners. Even those who were in the class from the beginning did not notice his presence. The teacher had pale skin, a sullen look, and long fangs. He introduced himself as Bloody Greg, the one teaching this lesson. Picking up the sphere from the table, he announced that he was happy to teach them. He explained that the spheres were made of star spirit stone and were particularly sensitive to mana. Star spirit stone is an ore that has absorbed the sacred energy emitted by the stars. The professor asked everyone to stand up and direct their mana into the sphere. Lihan wasn't sure if he could do it. When he placed his hand on the sphere, it flew up, causing surprise among everyone present. He still doubted himself. After all, even the light spell had failed, but he was still glad that he had succeeded this time. He immediately thought that this was not an ordinary stone, but perhaps a real artifact. Noticing the initials on the surface, he decided that the professor had probably created it himself. While he was thinking about the price of the artifacts, the student behind him was barely coping with her sphere. Suddenly, her sphere broke out of control and rushed towards the ceiling, clearly intending to break through it. The professor immediately stopped her and explained that each ball obeys the will of the student, but is bound by a contract so as not to destroy the building. This calmed the girl down. It was obvious that she was seriously worried. At that very moment, the ball suddenly changed trajectory and hit the girl in the stomach. The professor clarified, "The contract, unfortunately, does not apply to students." He asked everyone to be careful not to destroy the ball. The girl asked, maybe he meant so that no one would get hurt, but he simply ignored her words and ordered the spheres to be raised into the air again. The next task was to draw a circle with a sphere. The task turned out to be not easy, but the students tried. Even if it was an artifact, it was still difficult to control. One of the students did it and decided to show the result to the professor. But instead of praise, he received only a short instruction. Repeat. Lihan hoped that the entire lesson would not be limited to just this exercise. He decided to check this with the teacher. The answer was laconic. Only when they achieve mastery in this. The students sighed in disappointment. One even asked for permission to leave. In response, he heard that he did not need to ask for this. The 2 immediately stood up, collected their things and left, deciding not to return. The girl, hesitating, was also about to leave. But suddenly, she felt ill. She lost consciousness and fell right onto the desk. Li Han thought she was just pretending and even praised her for her excellent acting. Nevertheless, Li Han decided to check if the girl was okay. Taking a closer look, he realized that this was not a pretense at all, but a real depletion of mana. He reported this to the professor, but he only coldly replied that the girl could return to drawing the circle when she felt better. This indifference puzzled Li Han. Now he realized that he would be left alone in the class. While the professor was reading some book, Li Han continued training. To break the silence a little, he asked how grades were awarded in this class. In response, he heard that the number of students does not matter. Grades depend only on their rank. Li Han was delighted. This approach made the subject ideal for him. He was already mentally calculating if he maintained good grades in the other subjects, then he was guaranteed an A here. He liked the task itself. It was monotonous and did not require much effort. The professor watched him furtively, surprised that he had decided to stay. He compared students to waves. After the first lesson, no one usually returned. Last year, not a single student remained. But Greg didn't mind. His contract only required him to teach the class, not guarantee attendance. He always hoped that one day he would simply not see a single student in his class. But today, one remained, and exceeded expectations. From his speech and manners, it was clear that he was from a noble family, but at the same time he looked too mature for his age. It was clear at first glance that the student was unusual, and Greg even wanted him to continue attending classes. Later, Li Han sat with his friends in the break room. He tried to persuade them to attend the class, assuring them that they could get an excellent grade for simply attending. Yona was still hesitating, but Gabriel decided to clarify. What exactly do they teach there? Li Han explained what he had been doing throughout the entire lesson, adding that the teacher had not explained anything else. This surprised the friends, but they showed no real interest in the subject. They thought the professor might be a fraud, but Li Han was only concerned about the final grade. This surprised them even more. They did not expect that Li Han was interested exclusively in grades and not knowledge. Yona considered herself pragmatic, but Li Han was on another level. He only cared about profit. He didn't insist that they go with him. He just stood up and headed to his next class. Gabriel asked what his next subject was and was stunned. It turned out to be fencing. When he reached the hall, Li Han was surprised by the number of students. He expected a much smaller group. They were all from the White Tiger Tower, and therefore almost certainly from knightly families. Li Han reassured himself that the lesson would not be a problem for him, since he had trained a little with a sword as a child. Some students, noticing him, began to whisper, discussing that he was from the Blue Tower. Contemptuous smirks were not long in coming. Everyone knew that nobles rarely paid attention to fencing. Li Han was prepared for their arrogance, but the scale of their ridicule still surprised him. He decided not to react. After all, these were teenagers in front of him, and there was nothing unexpected about it. An orc approached him and, stopping next to him, asked if he really was from the Vardanaz family. Li Han confirmed, and immediately heard that, most likely, he had come to the wrong address. Masters had gathered here, not newbies. He didn't want to stir up conflict, so he calmly thanked him for the warning. But this reaction only angered the orc. He made it clear that no one would hold back because of his inexperience. Li Han just smiled and said that he would try not to hurt anyone in the duel. This phrase finally drove the orc crazy. He wanted to answer, but they were interrupted. The professor ordered everyone to gather. The lesson was about to begin. An elf with a metal arm and leg and a scar across his eye stood before the students. He introduced himself as Elliot. At the sight of the professor, the orc cooled down slightly. Elliot started by saying that everyone has some skills, and this course will either help them develop them or gain confidence in wielding a sword. Li Han, noting to himself that he was only interested in the grade, nevertheless listened with respect to the words that the teacher was ready to share his personal techniques. At that moment, someone touched Li Han's shoulder. He turned around and saw an elf guy in front of him. He was strikingly handsome, and Li Han immediately decided that he would definitely be popular with the girls. The elf was interested in why Li Han chose to learn fencing, since his family was famous for the magical arts. Without a second's hesitation, Li Han replied that it was easier to get a high score in unpopular courses. Such a straightforward answer took the elf by surprise. Li Han believed that being honest from the start would free him from misunderstandings and make communication easier. The guy introduced himself as Derek Maradi and asked to be addressed by his last name. Extending his hand, Li Han noticed that despite his young age, Derek's palms were covered in calluses. The Maradi family was renowned for guarding the empire's northern borders and resorting to any means necessary to achieve their goals. However, Derek himself did not fit this image at all, although who, if not him, should know that rumors do not always reflect reality. Li Han remembered the technique John had taught him, the blue stone, simple but effective. Despite the difficult training, he tried his best and did not give up. His efforts did not go unnoticed. The professor took notice of him. Elliot was curious about what family he was from. He even managed to put forward his own guesses based on his skills. But the answer he heard surprised him. Li Han knew basic techniques, although he was from a family of magicians. Then he asked why he needed fencing. In response, he heard that Li Han considered this an important skill for a nobleman. However, seeing how the professor's face darkened, Li Han immediately realized that this was not what he wanted to hear. He recognized that look. If he said anything else wrong, he could say goodbye to his good grades. So he quickly added that at first he thought exactly that way, but once he started practicing, he realized that he couldn't stop. This answer, on the contrary, clearly pleased the professor. His face even changed. Elliot was pleased that Li Han, despite his origins, chose something he really liked. He even praised him. His form is better than some of the white tiger. After this, the professor decided not to give him any breaks and challenged him to a duel. Li Han didn't expect this turn of events. He came for a grade, not to fight with the teacher. After a long sparring session, Li Han collapsed to the ground, covered in bruises, dust, and exhausted. The professor stood above him, towering triumphantly. He then crouched down and extended his hand to Li Han to help him up. Along the way, he gave him some advice on the blue stone technique, and then suggested that they finish for today. Turning to the others, the professor, full of enthusiasm, suggested that they also join the fight. While Li Han walked, feeling every pain in his body and counting the blows he received, the professor defeated others with one move. Li Han recalled the fight and realized that Elliot seemed to have a sixth sense. He hit precisely in unprotected areas. All the White Tiger students were future knights, but even they lost to him in seconds. If John was like an unshakable rock, then Elliot was a seething stream, swift and flexible. At the same time, he had mastered many techniques and explained to everyone what needed to be improved. However, Li Han was left with a strange feeling. Looking at the others, he understood. He had been beaten worse than everyone else. It was already getting dark outside, the lesson was coming to an end, but the professor still called Li Han over. This made him a little wary. He didn't understand what else was needed. Besides him, the professor also called that same orc. As it turned out, he was from Choi's house. Li Han immediately remembered. It was this orc who tried to provoke a conflict before the start of the lesson. And then Elliot announced the decision, a duel. The statement shocked all the students. A buzz immediately arose in the hall. Everyone was discussing that the fight would clearly be unequal. The orc broke into a smug smile. He already considered the victory his. The professor gave both of them wooden swords. Li Han did not think of retreating. He was confident in himself. Even though he could do nothing as a child, he went through hard training. Raising his sword, he pointed it at his enemy and was ready for battle. The reason the professor chose them for sparring was simple. These two stood out among all the students. To achieve a high level in fencing, theory is not enough. Real combat is also necessary. For example, let's take a move in which the opponent aims for the neck. But it's difficult to win with technique alone. You also need reaction, understanding of the situation, and ingenuity. They had everything, both technique and experience. They could even direct mana into a sword, albeit only a little. The professor gave the command to take positions. Elliot was still surprised at how Li Han was able to reach such a level. Coming from a family of mages, the professor even shed tears, remembering what he probably had to hear from his family. And this only increased his pride in his student. He decided that he would do everything to guide him along the path of the sword. A wave of his hand. The duel began. The Choi House was a master of the art of the moon peak, swift and furious, and the blue stone technique was distinguished by its solidity and strength. The two styles were complete opposites. The professor expected the fight to teach them both useful lessons. Li Han was in no hurry to attack, so the orc did not hesitate and was the first to go on the offensive. He gathered mana into the blade and prepared to deliver a powerful blow. However, Li Han managed to dodge, catching a bit of the ground with his boot. Taking advantage of this, he threw dust into the enemy's eyes, temporarily blinding him. The orc roared in pain and surprise. None of the students expected such a move from Li Han. Many considered this unfair, as such an action violated the spirit of the duel. However, the professor, on the contrary, praised Li Han for his intelligence. This left the students even more shocked. While Choi rubbed his eyes, trying to get rid of the sand, the professor said, "In battle, there is only life and death, and any techniques are acceptable if they lead to victory." Without giving the orc time to come to his senses, Li Han went on the attack. He channeled mana into the blade again, preparing to deliver a precise blow to his confused opponent. The professor understood that it would be difficult for students brought up in the spirit of honor to accept such a reception, but on a real battlefield, no one would think about nobility. Of all those gathered here, it was Li Han who was the real swordsman, and the professor was delighted that he had come to his course. At the last moment, Choi managed to block the blow. Now he regretted that he had allowed himself to relax. Li Han, although he was from a family of magicians, was clearly not a weakling. He regretted even more that he had fallen for such a simple trick with sand. Realizing that he had a chance to win, Li Han continued the pressure. As soon as his blow was parried, he immediately delivered a new one that the orc had to block with his hand. He had been closely watching his opponent's movements even during the fight with the professor. Even then, he realized that Choi was strong. Another trick was used. Li Han stepped on the orc's foot without hesitation. He realized that any opportunity could become decisive, and he himself had to create it. Choi was furious now. He could still chalk up the sand to carelessness, but a deliberate blow to the leg was too much. Trying to escape the continuous attacks, the orc stumbled, fell, and rolled back. Now, Li Han himself was caught off guard. He hoped that he would bring the fight to the end with constant pressure, but Choi simply ran away. Orc was hurt by this reception. It wounded his honor. But losing to a youth from a family of magicians would be even more humiliating. The professor did not hide his delight at what was happening, while the other students looked at each other in confusion. Choi rose and rushed back into battle, not intending to forgive Li Han for his humiliation. But Li Han deftly dodged and blocked every blow. While the battle was raging, the professor reflected. The duel had exceeded all his expectations. The art of the moon peak made Choi a formidable opponent, but he was weakened too quickly. The blows were powerful, but exhausting. Li Han, however, remained cool, confidently parrying the attacks. He carefully watched every movement of the enemy, analyzing, and he realized the orc began to lose control. Li Han felt a strange pressure from the enraged orc. Li Han forced himself to pull himself together. He had no right to show his emotions. Remembering their fight, he realized that Choi was a bad decision-maker. Any unexpected action would throw him off balance. Besides, the orc seemed to be approaching his limit. It was clear from him that his mana was running out, and his strength too. Li Han had a serious advantage. He hardly got tired from using mana. All that was left was to hold on until Dylan finally ran out of steam. Apparently, the orc himself realized this too. He began to miss blows more often. But he was tormented by the question, why didn't Li Han get tired at all? Maybe he himself didn't hit hard enough. With each passing second, it seemed to him more and more that he was fighting not a man, but a motionless rock. He began to doubt. Was he playing into the hands of his opponent? Li Han noticed the confusion in his opponent's eyes and decided to take advantage of the moment. With one precise blow, he knocked the sword out of Choi's hands. It sank into the ground, flying a considerable distance. Li Han's next blow landed right next to the orc's ear. Victory was his. While Choi was coming to his senses, the professor loudly announced the end of the duel. He knew full well that the fight could have gone very differently if Choi had not succumbed to the pressure. For a boy his age, accepting defeat will not be easy. At the same time, Li Han exuded confidence and poise. He looked like a true aristocrat. Despite the spectacular nature of the fight, the victory was not entirely pure. The professor hoped that both would learn lessons and become stronger. He offered the duelists a handshake. Li Han immediately tensed up. He doubted that Choi would let it go so easily. But to his surprise, Dylan extended his hand first, and even apologized for being rude before the fight. This stunned Li Han, but upon reflection, he realized that these were sincere words, and not an attempt to distract his attention. He shook hands with his opponent and felt satisfied with the outcome. The professor was also pleased. He even applauded. But the students did not fully understand why a duel was considered good. But one single glance from the professor made everyone follow his example and praise the fighters. That evening, when classes ended and the students began to disperse to the towers, the White Tiger students surrounded Dylan Choi. Derek was sure that after such a disgrace, he couldn't just leave. But Dylan wouldn't agree. He admitted defeat. He lacked experience, that's all. The others were not happy with this answer. They blamed not Dylan, but Li Han, who threw sand in the opponent's face. But Derek was worried not about his friend, but about the honor of the tower. In his opinion, it had been trampled by the Blue Dragon. He intended to make Dylan pay back the debt, at any cost. House Maradi stood at the head of the knighthood, and therefore to contradict them was tantamount to signing one's own death warrant. The plan was simple. If one couldn't defeat Li Han, let the three of them win. Dylan categorically refused to participate. It would have been shameful for him. But Derek was adamant. In his opinion, only losers think that way. Some students doubted this, but no one dared to contradict. As he passed by, Dylan quietly said he would not take revenge and considered the fight fair. Derek snorted contemptuously and called him a coward. He immediately began looking for a replacement. This caused heated discussions. There were many who wanted to avenge the honor of the tower. Dylan himself kept to himself. He understood that Li Han was talented, but three people couldn't handle it alone. He could not allow this to happen and decided to intervene despite the possible consequences. Without delay, he went to warn Li Han of the danger. But, having reached the right place, I realized that I was too late. One of the White Tiger students was lying on the floor. The others pointed their sticks, which had turned into swords, at Li Han, but there was fear on their faces. Li Han himself, without showing panic, held several stones in the air, keeping the attackers at a distance. What he saw shocked Dylan. He knew that Li Han was strong, but he had no idea that he had already mastered magic. Some time ago, students from the White Tiger Tower surrounded Li Han. They wanted to take revenge for what they considered a dirty duel. Li Han himself doubted that the whole thing was about that duel, but he decided to scare them. Suddenly, they would remember which house he belonged to. He warned sharply, hinting at his origins, and watched their reactions closely. Despite their feigned indifference, Li Han noticed that they were genuinely afraid of the possible consequences. From the way they looked at each other, it was clear that someone was standing behind them, and they were counting on his protection in case of failure. If they had any common sense, they wouldn't have gotten into this in the first place. Li Han's guess turned out to be correct. But when he asked directly who exactly had sent them, no one opened their mouth. Instead of answering, they began to approach, clearly intending to prevent him from escaping. John once taught Li Han, if there are many enemies, it is better to retreat. But the path to retreat was already cut off. Suddenly, he remembered one spell. There were some small stones on the floor, a little larger than a feather. He decided to use them. Having spoken the necessary words, the very ones that had earlier made the feather float, he lifted them into the air. The opponents recoiled. None of them had yet mastered magic, and therefore were caught off guard. Li Han felt a surge of joy. It worked. He hoped that this would be enough to scare them off. But just as he was about to warn them, one of the stones flew out of control and hit the nearest student in the back of the head. Neither Li Han nor his opponents expected this, but now Li Han understood. Theory is nothing without practice. The stone flew up so quickly that no one even noticed how it happened. He had no intention of threatening, but now he had no choice but to continue the game. However, the effect was more than effective. The students grabbed their injured comrade and quickly retreated. At that moment, Dylan arrived. He stopped, not believing his eyes. Li Han had decided that he too had come to fight, but the orc immediately refuted his suspicions. Dylan explained who was behind the attack. In the Blue Dragon Tower, everything resembled a ball or a social salon. Families, customs, etiquette. But in the White Tiger there was a strict hierarchy. Dylan even scratched a crude portrait on the ground of the man who had directed the students to Li Han. Li Han recognized him immediately. It was the guy who approached him before the fencing began. Because of his cute appearance, he seemed friendly to Li Han, but appearances rarely match the essence. As Dylan continued to speak, Li Han barely listened. He wondered, why was Giselle holding a grudge against him? Returning to reality, he expressed bewilderment out loud. Dylan put forward several versions. The most obvious one is Li Han of the Vardana's clan, and defeating him early on in his training will give Giselle influence. Li Han realized with bitterness that he was considered a trophy. And Dylan was already worried about something else. Li Han's results will only get better with each passing day, and this will only increase the White Tiger's hatred. Giselle was very good at stirring up such feelings. Dylan only advised him to be careful if he decided to continue fencing. Back in the tower, Li Han thought about Choi's words. He advised staying away from classes where White Tiger students might be. But Li Han wasn't going to give up so easily. This item was too convenient for him. Then he came up with a plan. He went out into the common room and called everyone over. Deliberately pretending to be barely able to stand, he claimed that he had been attacked by White Tiger students. The reason? Only one. He was from the Blue Dragon Tower. He was curious how the others would react. The effect was astonishing. The students erupted in rage. They began to make noise, shouting that the White Tiger did not understand who he was dealing with. One even mentioned that he expected an attack on Gauriel, but not on Vardanaz. The prince did not understand why he was suddenly dragged into it, and Li Han himself was shocked by the reaction. He did not think that it would cause such a storm. He hastened to stop them. In fact, everything was not so serious. But the students were not going to back down. They felt they owed Li Han something. After all, he fed them. Li Han's conscience began to torment him. He had, in fact, lied. The students lined up and were ready to perform. Now everything threatened to escalate into a full-scale conflict between the towers. He had no idea how deep the enmity between the Blue Dragon and the White Tiger was. The students were already rushing towards the exit, grabbing everything that could be useful in the battle. Suddenly, Asan stepped forward and shouted loudly, demanding that they stop. Everyone turned to him. Asan urged the students not to give in to emotions. He reminded them that the White Tiger Tower is a citadel of knights, and it would be reckless to act against it in the heat of the moment. Li Han felt relieved. At least someone decided to calm the crowd. But Asan himself was not going to retreat. He suggested waiting for the right moment to strike back. The idea quickly gained support, with everyone rejoicing that they had a strategist from the Dalcard family. Li Han's joy immediately turned into disappointment in himself. He felt like an idiot, because he had hoped that everything had calmed down. He tried once again to convince his classmates that he had never asked them to take revenge for him. Li Han said that it was a matter of his personal honor, and that he was the one who should deal with the matter. The nobles were sure that the knights from the White Tiger were vile and treacherous. Li Han reminded them that they were all descendants of noble families, and if they acted as enemies, how would they be different? These words made the students think. Li Han felt that he had at least got the point across a little. He proposed a compromise. If the White Tiger did attack, they would act as a united front, but never first. The idea was liked. The students decided to stick together and be prepared. As the crowd began to disperse, Li Han thought he had managed to stop the conflict between the families. But one girl remembered that the next lesson they would take would be with representatives of the White Tiger. Some of the students had already mastered light magic, and were sure that no one in Tiger Tower had come close to this yet. Listening to their conversation, Li Han suddenly realized something important. He was the only one who had not yet been able to create a light spell. The next morning, Yona found Li Han in the break room while stretching sweetly. His appearance alarmed her. To her question, he tiredly replied that he had not slept. He had been training all night. She reminded him that he was not allowed to practice magic on his own. But, remembering the professor's permission, she still did not understand why he was so eager to pursue light magic. Li Han didn't answer. Instead, he looked at Gabriel, who had just come down. He said hello, but Gabriel didn't seem to notice him. Instead, he pulled out an impromptu shashlik from his robe, sausages and potatoes on a stick. Sitting down by the fireplace, he began to brown it over the fire. Li Han came up behind him and said with a smile that no one was going to take his food away. Gabriel dropped the treasure in surprise. Gabriel asked how long they had been standing there, to which he received the answer that the guys had been here the whole time. Yona nodded at the sausages and reminded them that they were already starting to burn. Gabriel hurried to save them. Looking around the room, Li Han realized that the other students looked exhausted as well. They were hungry, and although Li Han sold them food, it was barely enough to bring them back to their senses. He thought that he needed to come up with something urgently. The food was running out, and Professor Joseph didn't even respond to requests. He was stingy to the last. One day, he and Yona tried to sneak into the hut for supplies, but were caught. They discussed whether to smuggle something out secretly, but that option was also out of the question. Everyone gathered for the basic magic lesson. Professor Garcia was already waiting for them in the classroom. It took her one look to understand that there was a strange tension in the air. Firstly, the students were exhausted. A week without normal food had taken its toll. Secondly, there was clearly a conflict brewing between the towers. But Garcia knew that when two very different people fight, it's one thing. But when two similar people, like the white tiger and the blue dragon, clash, it's far more dangerous. She hurried to seat a couple of students who were about to start a fight. Remembering the director's words, "Competition makes you stronger," she barely contained her irritation. She wanted the students to find a common language, not fists. One stern look from her, and silence reigned in the classroom. The professor decided to find out who had managed to create a light spell. Li-han, yawning, raised his hand. But apart from him, there was not a single hand. He thought he was falling behind. He was taken aback. The professor merely nodded and said that this was exactly what she had expected. He leaned towards the guy who had been bragging about his successes yesterday. He awkwardly admitted that he had only just understood the theory, but the spell still hadn't worked. Li-han listened to this with disappointment, cursing himself for the sleepless nights spent in vain. But the professor added that two students from the Blue Dragon Tower had already mastered the spell. Li-han was surprised. Another hand rose from the back row, Princess Adele. He was glad that it was she and turned to meet her gaze. But her gaze was cold. She looked at him as if he were an enemy. Li-han did not understand what was going on. Asen gently nudged him by the shoulder. He believed that the princess believed the rumors that were circulating. Li-han did not immediately understand what rumors were being discussed, so he decided to clarify. Asen sighed and said, "They say he is here only for grades, not for knowledge." This gossip angered Asen even more than Li-han. But Li-han didn't understand his irritation. After all, it was true. Although Li-han was not at all bothered by this, Asen seemed to be seething with anger. He couldn't believe that the princess actually believed such pathetic rumors. Li-han merely reminded him that Adele was free to believe whatever she wanted. This answer puzzled Asen. Now he considered Li-han almost a saint. He not only did not get angry, but also continued to treat the princess with kindness. Asen considered him a true example for other nobles. It was precisely to find such a friend that he entered the academy. He continued to praise Li-han, but he still couldn't understand what exactly was wrong with his friend. The professor asked the students to demonstrate what they had learned. Li-han was the first to volunteer. The room was illuminated by a bright light, almost like sunlight. Adele followed suit, her soft blue glow filling the rest of the class. Everyone stood in silence, unable to utter a word. The professor enthusiastically praised both of them. Rarely did anyone master this spell in the first week. However, there was no joy among the students. Sensing the growing tension, Garcia was quick to remind him that this was only the first step, and it was never easy. But Li-han understood. It wasn't about magic. There was a real conflict raging between the towers, and the students were not listening to the professor at all. She tried to calm the class down and asked everyone to take their seats. They complied, but managed to exchange some barbed remarks along the way. Garcia then announced that they would be studying elemental magic this semester, which immediately caught the attention of the entire audience. Many literally beamed with joy. Elemental magic includes 5 elements: fire, water, earth, air, and darkness. This is the foundation of all magic. Summoning spirits, creating artifacts. Everything requires knowledge of the elements. Even with a simple spell, a magician will be respected anywhere in the world. The professor asked everyone to find out which element was closest to them. Some decided to focus on one element. Others dreamed of mastering the one they considered their own. At her command, a candle with a tiny flame appeared in front of everyone. The spell scheme is the same as in the previous lesson. Only now you need to imagine not light, but fire. But she also warned that fire should be handled with extreme caution. It can burn. As an example, Garcia raised her staff and channeled mana into it. A fiery tornado rose up in the classroom, reaching all the way to the ceiling. Li-han had a hard time keeping himself from admiring it like a child. The sight was truly mesmerizing. The professor collected the flame in her palm and extinguished it, ending the demonstration. Her suggestion to try it out caused a stir. Students were eager to get to practice. Everyone tried their best. Everyone wanted to master the spell as quickly as possible. But before starting, Li-han thought, it was not for nothing that the professor gave them the candles. He decided that if you can see what you want to create, it will be easier to imagine it. Just as he was about to cast a spell, Garcia suddenly stopped him. The candle in front of him immediately melted into a stream of mana. She warned Li-han that he couldn't use fire magic yet. This caught him off guard. She explained that she did it for safety reasons. Remembering how he had been blinded by his own light spell, Li-han understood what she was getting at. If the light had merely blinded, the fire could have exploded, with far more serious consequences. Instead, the professor suggested that he try water magic and promised that he would return to fire later, when he learned to control mana better. A bowl of water appeared in front of him. But this option did not suit Li-han. He dreamed of fire. It looked too cool. He knew that fire and lightning were strong in attack, earth and metal in defense. And water? The only thing is that you could drink it anywhere. But he didn't argue. He understood that Garcia was right. Asen envied him. Not everyone received a special assignment from the professor. But Li-han himself felt only irritation. He didn't want to be special at this moment. Li-han began to practice water magic, although in his soul he was still worried. He wanted to study fire, like everyone else. Only on the third attempt did he manage to set the water in motion. Asen, who was sitting next to him, noted with surprise how quickly Li-han mastered this element. A neat ball of water hung above his palm, shimmering in the air. This amazed not only the students, even the professor enthusiastically acknowledged Li-han's natural affinity for water. She announced to everyone that Li-han had successfully completed the practice of elemental magic, causing the students of Blue Dragon Tower to burst into raptures. But the students from the White Tiger Tower did not share this joy. The professor was quick to remind everyone that there was no need to rush. Not everyone can master every element. The choice of element is also influenced by the conditions in which the student grew up. Those who grew up by the sea most often feel a kinship with water. The closer a person is to a particular element, the easier it is for him to imagine it during witchcraft. Li-han thought he had never been particularly connected with water. He believed that if he had been carried to the lake, it would most likely have been as part of some kind of severe test or punishment. At this time he felt a heavy gaze. Adele did not take her eyes off him. That intense gaze burned the back of his head. But Li-han didn't understand the reason for such attention. As soon as he turned around, she immediately looked away. His thoughts were distracted from the spell, and a ball of water splashed onto his head. The professor gently reminded about the importance of concentration. She gathered some mana in her palms and created a flow of air. The wind quickly dried Li-han's clothes, for which he was grateful. She seemed to be the only adequate teacher in the academy. He wondered how long the water practice would take. Usually, students were asked to maintain the form until their mana ran out, but Li-han never ran out of mana. So he was instructed to hold the ball until the end of the lesson. The task clearly did not please him. He perceived it as a form of punishment. He wanted to object, but the professor had already gone to the other students. He remembered that this was, after all, one of the teachers at the Mad Academy, which meant that she could not be normal by definition. The professor understood that the task seemed burdensome to him, but she considered it necessary. To create such a large water ball in just 3 attempts is a sign of talent. Moreover, Li-han had one of the largest mana reserves in the history of the academy, and this only strengthened her desire to raise him to be an outstanding mage. She wished him luck, mentally. And Li-han, holding back the shape of the ball, quietly cursed all the teachers at once. The class ended, but the tension between him and the teacher only increased. Li-han was actively indignant about the injustice. Professor Joseph had difficulty grasping the gist of his complaints. It turned out that Li-han was outraged by the fact that Adele had mastered fire, Yona had mastered the wind, and he was forced to mess around with water. Even Gabriel controlled fire, although he almost burned his own things in the process. Lihanu was offended. He stared at the water the entire lesson. The professor suggested that perhaps the teacher simply liked him, since she worked so carefully with him. Lihan took the hint and moved on. He said that, for the same reason, he was forced to work in her garden on Friday. However, Joseph reminded, Lihan himself volunteered to help. Some time ago, he himself came to the professor's hut and offered help. In return, he asked for food from the hut, and the professor was glad that someone decided to help at all. Lihan insisted that he had already eaten and simply wanted to take some food with him, but the professor apparently understood his intention. The thought that he couldn't let his guard down for even a second didn't make him happy. Joseph didn't quite understand how a man like Lihan could even belong to the Vardana's house. After taking a sip of tea, the professor asked if there had been any problems with other students. Lihan admitted that relations with the White Tiger Tower leave much to be desired. Joseph just chuckled, as if nothing changes from year to year, and this calmed Lihan down a little. He could not understand where the students got the strength to quarrel when all their energy was spent on magical training. The professor liked this idea. He advised Lihan to simply ignore the students from the White Tower, even if they were picking on him. There was an awkward silence for a moment. Lihan, after a little hesitation, nevertheless admitted that he had already fought with them. Professor Joseph's disapproving gaze did not escape Lihan's attention. The teacher, accustomed to a peaceful start to the semester, decided to clarify what exactly had happened. Upon hearing that the attack was due to the choice of fencing class, the professor could not stand it. Tea spilled out of his mouth. The professor's reaction frightened Lihan, and he hurried to check if everything was okay. Joseph was outraged. The choice of this particular class seemed like a provocation to him, since fencing was considered the territory of the White Tiger, and students from there did not tolerate encroachment. Lihan recalled that no rules prohibited choosing this subject. However, what happened can no longer be changed. The professor noted that, although the opponents did not shine in magic, they knew how to handle weapons. To this, Lihan responded with a slight smile. 3 against 1 was difficult, but he managed. This attitude only increased the professor's shock. Rising from his chair, he announced that he had had enough for today and went to prepare food. The proposal was met with clear approval, but Joseph's thoughts were already filled with worry. Lihan was beginning to seem dangerous. After a hearty lunch, the professor breathed a sigh of relief, and Lihan was quite pleased. While clearing away the dishes, the young man noticed that the entire household seemed to be run by just one person. When asked directly, the professor confirmed that he had to look after the hut himself. This was considered basic alchemy. All the others were lazy or ran away. Hearing this, Lihan was genuinely surprised. All these tasks seemed ordinary to him, especially in comparison with his previous experience. Noticing an empty plot of land, he asked if he could plant something on it. The professor was interested in the idea and became curious about what exactly the young man intended to grow. The answer was cabbage or onion. Something simple. Joseph immediately understood where this was all heading. The young man intended to grow vegetables and then sell them. The professor was impressed by such insight, although not surprised. However, after a short pause, he admitted, Lihan was the first one to come up with this idea. This time he didn't even argue. If the student grows the crop himself, he is free to dispose of it as he sees fit. Meanwhile, Lihan began to think that vegetables alone would not fill his stomach. He needed a recipe. Deciding not to waste time, he turned to the teacher for advice. He confirmed that such ingredients made an excellent stew. The empire was distinguished by its diverse cuisine. Each corner had its own traditions. In Lihan's home region, bread and cheese were preferred. Eastern cuisine resembled Korean cuisine. Rice, noodles, soy products. When asked about his personal preferences, the professor replied that he liked the stew, but he avoided it. The reason was unexpected. The The food reminded him of the Eastern dwarves, whom he disliked. The interest in this explanation was understandable. The question concerned family. It turned out that it was in the Eastern lands that the professor's older relatives lived, who condemned his life choices. Eastern traditions were distinguished by their strictness, sometimes excessive. Soon the teacher asked if Lihan was free for the weekend. Such a question could arouse suspicions that another order was being prepared. However, this time the professor's intentions were different. In his opinion, a student might not even have enough time to look into the hut. He suggested thinking, what will students do if they experience hunger for several days? The answers that came to mind were alarming: rebellion, unrest. The professor interrupted these dark fantasies. Most likely, the students would simply start looking for any opportunity to get food. According to his observations, the turtles will be looking for fruits. The tigers will go hunting, but dragons usually connect later than everyone else. However, their resourcefulness did not fail them. After a few days, they always found a solution. This year the situation was especially interesting. After all, Li Kan, who had already proven himself in both magic and practical tasks, was with them. Then the young man decided to clarify why the professor did not mention the Red Phoenix Tower. The answer was simple. The students of this tower should not be taken into account in the fight for food. Descendants of priests and clergy, they did not seek to fight hunger. They only prayed. Such faith commanded respect, but did not seem close. It became clear. Lihan intended to go hunting with his friends on the weekend. And if there was a clash with the white tiger, the advantage in numbers would be on his side. The professor reasoned out loud. Lihan would most likely not avoid conflict, but there was still hope that he would refrain from open confrontation. At the same time, the teacher allowed that the students from the White Tiger Tower could make a completely different decision. This option especially interested Lihan. His question was answered simply: escape. The Magic Academy was surrounded by high-security walls, reinforced with protective charms. Despite this, every year one of the students still tried to escape. Under such a harsh regime, the thought of escape became especially tempting. Outside the academy, comfortable clothes awaited, delicious food, and comfortable living conditions. Lihan's thoughts were interrupted by the professor, who noticed from the expression on the young man's face that he was clearly thinking about something dubious. Joseph warned that it was often the white tigers who were the first to decide to escape, succumbing to such dreams. However, Lihan asked a direct question. Had anyone actually managed to leave the territory? This had happened, but the professor said it in a tone as if he doubted that anyone was listening to his advice at all. He did not go into details and only threw out the phrase, "Let everyone do as they see fit." Lihan tried to assure the professor that he had no such plans, but the smirk on his face said otherwise. Meanwhile, Dylan was surrounded by 3 men, blocking his way to the exit. Their words sounded like a threat. If he wanted to return to the room in one piece, he had to cooperate. However, one of the pursuers hastened to dissuade him. The threats were unnecessary. He pulled down his hood, revealing Lihan's face. Dylan showed no surprise. The rest were Gabriel and Yona. The prince couldn't understand why they were making such a scene when they all knew each other so well. He said with a grin that their attempts at intimidation were more reminiscent of the pranks of squirrels than a real danger. This comparison deeply offended one of those present. Lihan asked Gabriel not to lose his temper while he went to the window and let light into the semi-dark room. Yona snuffed out the candles and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Why did they have to go so far? The answer was simple. He wanted to spare Dylan any possible trouble because of their friendship, knowing full well that he himself was not popular. Dylan was surprised by how much thought had gone into it, although at the same time he was flattered by it. The real goal was different. Lihan saw him as a potential informant. The idea of being someone's spy clearly didn't appeal to Dylan. It hurt his pride. However, he explained that he was only rejecting the title itself, not the essence of the task. He was not against sharing information about Muradi's actions. Gabriel, hearing this, declared that the title spy was quite appropriate. But, catching Dylan's gaze, he immediately backed down from his words. Eventually, Lehane acknowledged that the title was inappropriate in Dylan's case. It was about justice, not surveillance. That wording puzzled the others. It was decided. From now on, Dylan would become a secret informant, albeit with the same tasks. He liked the new title. It sounded like the title of a fighter against injustice. As they shook hands, Yona was still thinking about what Lihan had been taught in his family. The reason for this early morning meeting was a plan to escape from the academy. Gabriel and Yona supported the idea, but Dylan was in shock. He could hardly believe that Lihan's words were spoken in earnest. But before Lihan could convince him, Dylan admitted that he had already thought about the same thing. This answer came as a surprise. Despite his knightly status, he also belonged to the nobility, and, like Lihan, he had not known the need for food since childhood. That is why hunger was especially difficult to bear. At this time, the White Tiger Tower was filled with excitement as the students prepared for the hunt. Their ardor was cooled by Giselle, who demanded silence. He thought hunting was a good idea, but reminded them that in the local conditions it would be far from an easy task. The example of the boar killed by Lihan was indicative. The creature was released by the alchemy teacher. Therefore, if the students wanted such a prey, they had to go deep into the forest, into unfamiliar and dangerous terrain. One of the students asked if there was an alternative plan. Giselle nodded. His proposal was unexpected: to leave the academy and go to the city. His main goal was to prevent his fellow students from even thinking about buying meat from the Blue Dragon Tower. Giselle's idea was met with enthusiasm. The students were pleased with his proposal. However, doubts remained. No one knew whether the plan would really be feasible. Muradi, who had his own strategy, expressed his willingness to accept allies. At the same time, he warned, if any of them violated the order and spoiled what was planned, there would be no mercy. Dylan secretly observed their conversation and later relayed what he heard to Lihan. He took the news with great interest and even thought about joining Muradi. However, Dylan was quick to cool his ardor by reminding him of the recent conflict. At first, Lihan thought that old grievances had already been forgotten, but when he noticed how the others shook their heads, he realized that he was mistaken. Given the difficult nature of the teachers, getting out of the academy was not an easy task, and a good cover was required. However, Muradi announced that he had already thought of everything. He had effortlessly subjugated the students of his tower, despite the fact that the semester had only just begun. Lihan was eager to know the details of the plan, but he could not find a way to get closer. The only solution was to accompany Muradi, a task that fell on Dylan's shoulders. This idea seemed dubious to him, but Lihan had no other option. Dylan found it all humiliating, but Lihan convinced him that he and Muradi were on opposite sides of the barricade. A well-known expression came into use: you need to know your enemy no worse than yourself. This was the strategy: to observe, study, understand every move of the opponent. Whether it was the facial expression, the tone, or something else that convinced Dylan, he himself couldn't figure out. But in the end, he agreed, which made Lihan very happy. Having received consent, Lihan hurried to see his comrade off, sending him on a mission as he went. By reminding him of his role not only as a knight, but also as an informant, Lihan gave importance to his mission. He believed in success, but still wished him good luck. Dylan, in turn, assured that he would not let us down. As the door closed behind him, Lihan considered his second escape option, but his thoughts were abruptly interrupted when Yona and Gabriel suddenly appeared nearby. Their suspicion grew. Why did Dylan suddenly agree so easily? It must be some kind of brainwashing magic. Evening had come and the sunlight was fading on the horizon. The group got back together, but this time Nicole joined them. Lihan thanked everyone for their presence and began to talk about the escape plan. Hearing this, Nicole was confused. She thought he was talking about hunting. The surprise stunned her. It was hard to believe that someone from the Vardana's family could have the idea of running away, and especially without preparation. Lihan hastened to reassure her, assuring her that the plan was already ready. Nicole became increasingly convinced that Lihan was an extraordinary person. At her request, he took out a package, supposedly with a plan. Inside was something strange, a crookedly drawn face and a caption that they should just follow this man, because he already had a ready-made plan. Nicole was speechless from such a brilliant move. Yona, noticing her friend's hesitation, decided to intervene. With a slight smile, she reminded Lihan that without Nicole, their plan could fail. He immediately got the hint and launched into a discussion about Nicole's irreplaceability. The girl didn't have time to get a word in edgewise. Lihan continued to convince her that the entire success of the mission depended on her exceptional tracking skills. The flattery, delivered with obvious admiration, made Nicole feel slightly embarrassed. At the same time, the others noted, if she doesn't want to, no one will insist. Under this gentle but persistent pressure, Nicole finally agreed. She confidently stated that since no one else could handle it, she had no choice. The sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, and Giselle's team was ready to go. The group consisted of 8 people, including the leader herself. Inspired by her speech, the students could hardly contain their joy. At last, there was hope of leaving this damned place. Giselle called everyone to action and pulled out a map from her pocket, the very one that was supposed to guide them along the way. Even before this moment, she had been desperately sorting through stacks of books in search of suitable information, but none of them contained what she needed. The servants who brought the volumes were noticeably nervous and kept apologizing. In irritation, Giselle ordered them to find something actually useful, and they quickly left the room. At that moment, her gaze fell on the map lying on the floor. Strange, but suspiciously detailed. Upon examining it more closely, she discovered that the diagram indicated a route to escape from the academy. She once thought that such things were created by weaklings who were unable to cope with the program. But when faced with the realities of the academy, she realized why such maps actually existed. Their detachment advanced slowly, lighting the way with torches, unaware that Lihan and his companions were following close behind them. Lihan advised to stay closer. The path ahead was difficult and, apparently, long. Gabriel wondered why Giselle had headed towards the mountains instead of taking the path to the main gate. The prince voiced his opinion, but Lihan merely told Dylan to keep an eye on him, and he did not object. This left Gabriel slightly confused as to what exactly Lihan meant. He explained that Nicole, as a hunter, had no problem with lifting. He and Dylan had good physical endurance due to sword training. Yona had often wandered through the mountains since childhood, but the prince was no different. After a long climb, Gabriel was exhausted and had to be carried on Dylan's back. Lihan couldn't help but admit that without Nicole, they wouldn't have been able to track down Giselle's group. In order to somehow be useful, he began to write down the route, a habit left over from his past life. Suddenly, Nicole raised her hand sharply, signaling to stop. She pointed out the behavior of the students in front of her. They suddenly stopped and started acting strangely. Gabriel suggested that they might have achieved their goal, but Lihan doubted it. Everything was happening too simply. A sudden chill ran down his spine. In fear, he looked around, checking if there was a monster lurking somewhere nearby. It turned out that he wasn't the only one who felt it. Nicole turned around almost at the same time, assuring him that she had already checked everything. Lihan tried to determine the source of the strange sensation. And then, for the first time, he thought about the lich. At that very moment, an ominous green face appeared in the sky, laughing with a terrifying echo. Panic began to take hold of the students as the first wisps of fog emerged from the fog. And then the director appeared. He caught the fugitives red-handed and seemed to feel genuine joy about it. His appearance plunged the group into real horror. Now they would not be able to leave unnoticed. He claimed that the map Giselle had used was one of the fakes he had distributed around the academy. Giselle didn't believe it. She had received the card before enrollment, but it suddenly began to disappear right in her hands. The director, pleased with what was happening, emphasized, "This will be a lesson. Never trust unknown sources." The shock paralyzed the students. Giselle collapsed to the ground, unable to believe what was happening. Likhan was choosing the right words, but he was sure of one thing. The director clearly enjoyed torturing the students. Meanwhile, the director offered to voluntarily return to the academy. The lich began to gather mana in his mouth, preparing for his next move. A condition was announced. While the students were returning, they should avoid meeting the skeletons, who would begin the chase. Any means were allowed to be used. Whoever was caught would be considered guilty. Whoever manages to get back will be declared clean. The lich winked meaningfully, enjoying the impending spectacle. The students rushed from their seats, trying to avoid being captured. Skeletons with swords in their hands and dogs with bones instead of flesh that accompanied them rushed after them. Nicole, overcome with fear, rushed away, gesturing to Lihan that he should run too. But he managed to grab her hand, demanding that she remain calm. It was hard to calm her anxiety. Panic was visible in the girl's eyes. She was sure that being caught meant death. Then Lihan noticed. The skeletons were not paying attention to them, and the most that threatened them was the punishment room. The word sent a noticeable shudder through Nicole, as scenes from Dark Rumors came to mind. She began to describe a gloomy torture chamber from which no one allegedly returned, to which Lihan reservedly noted that her imagination was impressive. Yona hurried to reassure her friend, while Lihan carefully watched the skeletons, trying to remain unnoticed. Thoughts were swarming in my head. How to get out of here? Somewhere in the distance, shouts were heard. Someone was being called to stand in battle formation to fight back the undead. The knights called out to their brothers. If they continued to run, the skeletons would never stop. This development of events did not surprise Lihan. He expected that the knights' pride would not allow them to retreat. Dylan approached him with concern in his voice, offering what he believed to be the only way to salvation. He spoke of the need to unite with the knights, casting aside past grievances. This was the only way to break out of encirclement. However, Lihan interpreted his offer differently, as a chance to escape while the knights fought, buying time for the others. Everyone except Dylan supported the idea without hesitation. All that remained was to find a weak spot in the encirclement ring, but everything was tightly closed. Then Lihan turned his gaze upwards to the director, who was still hovering in the air, checking his guess. And he turned out to be right. He continued to summon more and more skeletons, trying to overwhelm the students with numbers. This was not a test, but a real hunt. From the very beginning, he did not intend to let them go. The thought grew stronger. The director really considered such conditions to be the norm for those who had spent only a week at the academy. There was even a temptation to surrender, especially since those who tried to escape had already been captured. But as he watched them, Lihan noticed an important detail. None of the skeletons looked in his direction. He realized that perhaps their group was still invisible, even to the lich himself. This means that there is a possibility that this lich is just an illusion and does not fully exist. A moment with Asan came to mind when they were writing the rules and discussing the enchanted box. If all this is an illusion, as before, then we need to go in the opposite direction from the path of the students of the Tiger Tower. After sharing his findings, he noticed how it inspired others. And although Gabriel was not at all pleased with the prospect of going up the mountain, he had no choice. After half an hour of climbing, they came across a cave. Nicole looked around and made sure there were no monsters nearby. Lihan cast a light spell, allowing everyone to catch their breath after the long journey. Yona was still worried that the skeletons might catch up with them, but Nicole assured her that they didn't even try to pursue. Dylan, on the other hand, wondered how long the undead would last. Perhaps it would be worth breaking through them. However, Li Han reminded that the skeleton's numerical superiority made such a plan useless from the start. Taking sausages out of his backpack, he suggested that they have a little snack. Nicole, exhausted by thirst, reached for the flask, but it was empty. Without losing his composure, Li Han summoned a stream of clean water, which greatly surprised the girl. She had heard of such magic, but seeing it in real life was much more mesmerizing. While Nicole was filling the bottle, Yona suggested lighting a fire, as the coming night promised to be cold. Nicole quickly created a fire, lighting it with magic. She was glad that it worked on the first try, but she still envied Li Han. She dreamed of mastering water magic. His reaction was unexpected. His eyes filled with tears. He never liked his element. In response to her question, he only advised her to be grateful for the magic she possessed. Later, when everyone had rested a bit, they went out to explore. The cliff overlooked hordes of skeletons. Li Han, calling the director a psychopath, stunned Nicole. She did not expect such harsh words. He squeezed her shoulder tightly and began to say that true magic is born from freedom of consciousness. One must not allow fear to fetter the mind. The words sounded strange, but she decided to try. She believed him. The girl spoke loudly about the lich, even about to add something particularly caustic. But a sudden movement in the bushes made her flinch. She drew back closer to Li Han, almost falling into his arms. He, too, froze abruptly. In front of them stood figures that no one expected to see here. It was Giselle and another student from the White Tiger Tower. Li Han led everyone to a cave, the entrance to which was covered with robes, creating a semblance of shelter. The arriving students looked at him with doubt. For them, Li Han was still an enemy. Even the prince expressed his displeasure. The group was already running low on food, and now they had to share it. However, Dylan cut him off. He believed that Li Han had every right not to help at all, especially after everything that had been done to him. But, contrary to expectations, Li Han showed surprising friendliness. He offered water to everyone. This gesture earned Dylan's respect. In his eyes, Li Han's behavior looked truly noble. While the knights enjoyed the water and Dylan silently pondered what he had seen, Giselle was deep in thought. She wondered how their group had ended up here. Perhaps they, too, had followed a map. The idea that she might have been followed hadn't even occurred to her. But now, after such unexpected help, she didn't know how to behave. My father's words came to mind. A family never forgets insults, but only repays with kindness if it remembers kindness. Giselle almost decided to make contact with Li Han, but suddenly the student next to her swayed and fell to the ground. His body went limp, as if it had lost its strength, and this caused fear in the others. Nobody expected the guy to lose consciousness so suddenly. His friend said that it was clearly not fatigue that was the cause. Something strange was going on. But as soon as he said this, he himself, along with another student, collapsed to the floor. The whole scene seemed inexplicable to Giselle, until one guess occurred to her. She turned sharply to Li Han, and his expression left no doubt. He calmly poured out the rest of the water from her cup, confirming her guess. His words sounded cold. It was too late to change anything. Giselle's vision began to blur, and her consciousness began to fade. The next moment, her body sank down right in front of Li Han. He didn't hide his relief. From that moment on, there was one less task. Running his hand through her hair, Li Han mentally noted, if he was still hated for no reason, it would be easier to give him that reason. Dylan and Gabriel were confused. One was demanding an explanation. The other was getting worried. After all, he had drunk quite a bit. But the girls hastened to reassure them. There was no poison in the water, only a sleeping pill, and only in portions for the students of the White Tiger Tower. Gabriel was amazed that the girls knew about it. Li Han was sure that they would be able to hide the truth with their eyes. His action was not caused by personal hostility. It was a necessary decision. Throwing Giselle over his shoulder, he announced that the sleepers needed to be moved closer to the skeletons. Dylan didn't like the idea, but Lihan reminded him of Moradi's true nature, and the objections immediately died down. He was now more concerned with the question, where did the sleeping pills come from? Yona raised her hand to this. According to her, she noticed a sleeping herb in the mountains. This aroused genuine interest in Lihan. Yona explained how to grind it into powder and dissolve it in water. He suggested taking some in reserve, but Yona herself did not expect that she would have to use it so soon. The sleeping people were carefully carried to the foot of the hill and laid on the ground. The skeletons immediately discovered the bodies and dragged them away. This brought relief to everyone. The disappearance of the students should have led to the disappearance of the undead as well. Lihan, standing up, reminded them that they still had one more task. Since they had come this far, it was worth examining the area. He was interested in the length of the wall and the possibility of escape. Everyone immediately began to explore the area. Suddenly Gabriel tripped over a rock and began to fall. Lihan helped him up. The prince, barely catching his breath, began to complain of hunger. Dylan no longer had the strength to carry the prince on his back again. Nicole offered to light the way. They had gone too far, and the danger of meeting skeletons was noticeably reduced. In her opinion, walking in the dark tired them out much faster. Lihan immediately took out his wand and cast a light spell. However, the joy did not last long. Everyone was immediately overcome by a strange tremor. An unknown voice, coming from somewhere in the darkness, demanded that the light be turned off. It was interfering with sleep. The students froze, frightened. No one could determine where the voice was coming from. The unknown person repeated so that everyone would be silent. Then Lihan noticed a strange tree, huge, with a gnarled trunk. It seemed as if the voice was coming from its very core. The tree offered to answer a riddle. The correct answer would make them long-awaited guests. It went like this. The dwarf lit 5 candles, but 2 were blown out by the wind. He locked the windows. How many candles are burning? Lihan realized that this was a riddle trap. Most would say there are 3 burning, but they too will go out over time. While he was thinking, Gabriel shouted out that 3 candles were burning. This frightened Lihan. The consequences of an incorrect answer were unknown. However, the tree recognized the answer as correct. This development of events puzzled Lihan because his version was different. While he was trying to understand the logic, Gabriel was already proud of his guess. The tree explained that such riddles often involve candles that don't burn out. The riddle was solved, the tree recognized them as welcome guests and offered another one, promising a gift. Everyone was eagerly awaiting the riddle. The question was, who becomes a giant in the morning and shrinks at lunchtime? It's big again in the evening, but disappears at night? This riddle left me stumped. There were no options. Lihan was the first to guess that it must be a shadow. The tree confirmed the correctness of the answer. The others were surprised that he had managed to guess. However, Lihan had heard a similar riddle more than once in his past life. The king of Thebes already knew the correct answer, although the essence of the riddle varied. While Lihan was thinking, the tree praised his intelligence. Then the spirit invited everyone into the forest as long-awaited guests. The space changed, revealing a magical forest. Spirits resembling fairies began to swirl around them. The tree handed Lihan a wooden glass. An incomprehensible green liquid was bubbling inside. The drink didn't look safe, but it was impossible to refuse. Taking a sip, he felt a pleasant freshness. The effect was unexpectedly good. The drink was like a sip of cold water on a hot day. The others were also offered, but they doubted while Lihan drank calmly. The tree explained that the liquid was made from plants and asked if she liked the taste. Upon hearing an affirmative answer, the tree mentioned that it still did not know their names. Likan introduced himself, but the spirit was also interested in his last name. Hearing Vardana's, the tree was amazed. Its emotions were betrayed by exclamations. Quickly recovering, the tree apologized, citing rumors about the family. Lowering the branch, it praised Li Han for not mentioning the name himself. The question of what they were doing in the forest at night took everyone by surprise. Li Han referred to a normal walk. The tree doubted. After all, only a week had passed, and they were already looking for a way out? In response, Li Han cited personal reasons. While the others were looking at the spirits, Li Han asked about possible advice. The tree said that there is a way out, but it is almost impossible for beginners to overcome it. The walls stretched far, but the details were not revealed. In addition, touching them without caution could result in a strong blow. Hearing this, Li Han was visibly upset. The tree advised not to rush into looking for a way out. Everything is quiet now, but in a couple of weeks the monsters will become active. Li Han thanked for the advice. However, the spirit understood from his look. He was not going to give up. The tree found it interesting to watch him. It was time to give the promised gift. The branches closed around Li Han. They presented him with a staff, a powerful artifact for any magician. Professor Garcia's words came to mind. Artifacts are important, especially staffs. Many students will become disillusioned with the gifts of the academy as they progress through their studies. Among the first years this year, Li Han was the first to receive a new staff. This gift interested all of Li Han's friends, and the tree was curious whether Li Han himself liked it. Holding the staff in his hands, Li Han felt a pleasant warmth from it, as if it were alive. The tree extended its branch towards him, expecting the young man to be unusual. This staff had a spirit, and it would be extremely difficult for a mage of that age to notice mana in it. The tree warned that Li Han would only know the power of the artifact the moment it was first used. When asked why the spirit did not explain everything in advance, the tree replied that this was not necessary. Everything would be revealed on its own. Li Han's behavior and talent reminded the tree of one of his predecessors. The sun was approaching dawn, and the tree decided it was time for the students to return. After saying goodbye, it gently pushed them out of the magical space, forcing them to fly a little. Finally, it advised against using magic nearby. It could awaken other trees. The boys landed on the ground. Only Dylan and Nicole managed to stay upright without falling to the grass. The landing was painful. My body ached after the fall. As he was leaving, the tree reminded Li Han of a riddle. It could help him get out of this place. All the skeletons disappeared, and the students returned to the academy in the first rays of the morning sun. Upon reaching the room, Li Han fell onto the bed, exhausted and completely worn out. He was awakened by a loud knock on the door and someone's scream. I had to get up and open the door to the uninvited guest. It turned out to be Asen. He urgently wanted to share some important news. It turned out that the principal was gathering all the students outside to make an announcement. The thought that there might be talk of escape immediately and completely woke up Li Han. He decided that he needed to behave naturally and promised Asen to wake up the others. Outside, a fair was already waiting for the students. Almost everyone had gathered. Women in robes handed out cookies. One of them approached Li Han and handed him a treat. He was still confused. While he was eating, he was constantly thinking about why all this was happening and what to expect from the director. Soon the director himself came on stage and addressed the students. He introduced 3 people, priests who had arrived to visit the academy. The older woman thanked Lich for his hospitality. The director was flattered by her words about his busyness. He did not miss the opportunity and asked the priests to influence the emperor to increase the budget of the academy. The woman gently hinted that they couldn't do that. Li Han realized that he had seen something similar in his past life. The woman turned her attention to the students, trying not to look at the disappointed Lich. While she was explaining the purpose of her visit, Li Han noticed something odd. The guests had powerful mana, but they didn't look like magicians at all. Lost in thought, he didn't immediately notice how the director approached him. The director's voice pulled Li Han out of his thoughts and even scared him a little. He explained that priests have divine power instead of mana, hence the feeling of difference. Li Han understood why they seemed strange, and Lich understood that the student could sense mana. It was a blunder. Li Han didn't want to demonstrate this skill to the teachers. The director was puzzled. There were almost no such magicians left. Li Han tried to make excuses, saying that he had little knowledge, but the director insisted that he no longer hide his abilities. Li Han didn't like the direction of the conversation, although he didn't fully understand its essence. He mentioned that it was the first time in his life that he saw a priest. This did not surprise Lich. He said that Li Han's family does not believe in God, just like he does not. Li Han remembered his father's words about the holy power. It would not be surprising if there were rumors about his family hating priests. The director continued to reason, not understanding why the orders needed students who were only interested in food. And only then did Li Han notice the tables full of food. His eyes lit up, but he first decided to check with the director which orders he would recommend. The question caught the director off guard. After all, he had just called Li Han too smart to believe in a deity. But then it dawned on him. This wasn't about faith, but about profit. Did Li Han really want to join several orders at once? The young man only grinned, neither confirming nor denying. The director understood his intentions. Li Han wants to benefit from everyone. This only increased his sympathy for the student. He had not been so impressed for a long time. Lich, after some thought, recommended that Li Han start with the order of pressing. They believed in self-sacrifice, and in his opinion, that was where the newcomer would be most welcomed. The second one he suggested was the order of Colosso, followers of chaos. They, as the director joked, don't care whether anyone believes in gods at all. And finally, the order of Capolio. They worshipped a sword god and, in Lich's opinion, would be delighted by Li Han's swordsmanship. The last remark about swordsmanship alarmed the young man. He did not expect the director to know such details. Unpleasant memories from his past life were stirred up. The more the professors paid attention to him, the worse everything turned out. But Lich did not linger. He wished Li Han to make the right choice and said goodbye. His next stop was the recovery room, and that phrase made Li Han wary. He didn't expect the director to comment on the fate of the students from the White Tiger Tower. The Lich dissolved into thin air, leaving behind a familiar green mist. Li Han wondered if he should be even more careful now. He was almost certain who they were talking about. Yona interrupted the flow of thoughts. Judging by her appearance, she had been trying to find him for some time. When asked about his plans, Li Han answered honestly, he was going to visit one of the orders. Yona was surprised, but as soon as he mentioned 2 more orders, her eyes lit up. She immediately understood what he had in mind. Li Han noticed the basket in her hands and asked what was in it. The girl took out a sandwich with a smile. Its smell immediately made Li Han hungry. She explained that she had visited the Order of Flamen, where the god of alchemy is worshipped. There they recognized her immediately. Her family had been financing this order for many years. Li Han was amazed that such a thing was even possible. A little envious, he thought that his family had never supported anyone. On that note, he bid Yona a warm farewell and headed towards his first destination. At the tent, he found 2 priests and said that he was looking for the teaching of pressing. This made them incredibly happy. Rarely does anyone come of their own free will. Some of his classmates watched what was happening with confusion. Why did Li Han approach the priests? One of the servants called someone else and invited Li Han inside. The new arrival turned out to be a young girl with gray skin and small horns. Li Han immediately understood that she was half demon, a rare mixture of blood. Such traits could only appear after several generations. Although many avoided such people because of their appearance, Li Han knew that they were usually calm in nature. The attendant introduced the girl as Ting, a first-year student from the Red Phoenix Tower. According to him, apart from her, no one at the academy believed in pressing so sincerely. Li Han expressed his respect. saying that he could not have passed by knowing the purpose of this teaching. But inside, he was thinking about two things: what he could get from the order and what he would have to do for it. From the outside, the tent looked ordinary, but inside it was filled with artifacts, a real treasure trove of mana. Lihan wondered if they were creating magical items here. Soon, a woman entered the tent. Judging by the way they treated her, she was the one in charge here. But her appearance surprised Lihan. She literally pressed the ground beneath her, leaving dents with every step. She introduced herself as Mary. She looked fragile, but every step she took was heavy. Realizing that Lihan had noticed this, she explained that it was all because of the cursed artifact she was wearing. When asked why, Mary responded enthusiastically, "All for the sake of pressing. Pressing alone," she says, "carries the pain of the entire world." And his followers take some of this pain upon themselves by wearing cursed artifacts. Lihan groaned inwardly. He was already beginning to regret that he had believed the director's advice. Mary, noticing his doubts, calmly said that she would not hold him back. The path was difficult. Lihan almost turned to leave, but she added that she had prepared a gift for him, an artifact. But this gift was very peculiar. It slowly but continuously absorbed the owner's mana. And then Lihan became really interested. His main problem is excess mana. If an artifact could balance that out, he became inspired and immediately asked if the artifact had any other effects besides the curse. Mary was slightly surprised by this reaction, but still decided to tell. There have been many cases where a strong curse has also enhanced the effect of the artifact itself. Mary's artifact, for example, increased her weight, but at the same time significantly increased her divine power. She also mentioned that the artifact had an invisibility effect, but due to the constant absorption of mana, few people could use this effect. Mary was prepared for Lihan to refuse, and was surprised when he only silently placed his hand on the chest. But Lihan was fully prepared for the consequences. This touched Mary, because she was sure that he would leave. She felt ashamed of her previous doubts and of not having seen the strength of his faith. And Lihan was happy only with the benefit. Invisibility opened up many prospects for him. Wiping away tears of joy, Mary congratulated him on his official entry into the order. The chest contained Pressing's belt, but Lihan was only interested in the invisibility effect. He was immediately surrounded by servants filled with anxiety. They knew that newcomers always had a hard time after coming into contact with a cursed artifact. But Lihan calmly put on the belt and asked with interest how to activate invisibility, which confused everyone. They looked at each other with concern and started asking if he was okay. But Lihan sincerely didn't understand what they were expecting. Mary just shook her head, and with a soft smile reminded that the instructions were in the chest. After reading it, Lihan cast the necessary spell, and an impenetrable cloth enveloped him. He disappeared right before their eyes, causing real shock. Approaching the mirror and not seeing his reflection there, Lihan did not hide his joy. The effect was even better than he expected. Having removed the spell, he found himself behind the servants, who were trying in vain to figure out where he had disappeared to. However, he was also interested in something else, whether the curse really worked. Then he made up his mind and asked the priestess for another artifact. If the curse was not too dangerous, he would be able to compensate for it with quantity. His determination amazed Mary and even moved her to tears. But she gently asked not to rush and not to put pressure on herself. The second artifact could be obtained later. The argument dragged on, but Mary remained adamant. Only one for today. While she was telling the history of the order, Lihan was thinking about only one thing. He could already leave here with the artifact. They agreed that that was enough for today, and Lihan understood that as long as he wore the artifact, he could act freely. Before leaving, Mary handed him a basket full of food. She bought the groceries in advance, thinking that he would need them. Suddenly, Ding called out to him, also holding a basket, and handed it to Lihan. This surprised him, because the products clearly belonged to her, and he did not understand why she was giving them away. She just said that it was too much for her, and she didn't want it. Before Mary could stop her, Tink hurried away. But Lihan wasn't surprised at all. He expected something like this from a student of the Red Phoenix Tower. They were in every way the opposite of the students from the other towers. As he was leaving, Lihan heard the priestess's request to look after Din, because she was too strict with herself. He shrugged. How is that possible if they live in different dormitories? Then the priestess handed him another basket. He sighed and promised that she could be counted on. Along the way, he asked Tink to help him carry the baskets and began asking about life in the Phoenix Tower. He had heard that the students there hardly socialized, and it turned out the rumor was true. They devoted all their free time to prayer. There were even those who went into the forest or mountains at night to pray. Lihan was surprised because there was a curfew in effect at the academy, but Phoenix students were allowed to break it because of their special status. Then Lihan came up with a plan. If he could get hold of the Phoenix robe, he would be able to walk around at night without restrictions. He immediately asked if Ding could give him a priest's robe. The girl frowned. She didn't like the proposal. She thought he was looking for a way to reduce the effect of the curse, but Lihan insisted that he simply wanted to gain a deeper understanding of Pressing's faith. He managed to convince her. Ding promised to bring the robe to the next meeting. It was another step towards his goal, freedom and escape from the academy. Lihan wondered if Din was eating enough, to which she replied that she was quite satisfied with what she had. When he mentioned that the priestess had asked him to verify this, the girl's face dimmed a little. Then Lihan suggested that they dine together from time to time so that the priestess would have no reason to worry. He internally promised himself not to disappoint Mary, and from that day on, he intended to fatten up the girl at every meeting. Meanwhile, the principal gathered all the teachers in the teacher's room. Professor Garcia suggested that the discussion would involve assigning a mentor to the basic writing course. Professor Joseph recalled that these classes were previously taught by Professor Victor. However, as Garcia explained, he disappeared during the search for the unicorn. Without leaving his colleagues to guess, the director immediately announced that a replacement had already been found. This surprised everyone. Too little time had passed for such a quick reaction. But at the same time, the teachers were impressed with how quickly the director resolved the problem. Joseph immediately asked who would lead such important classes. The director assured everyone of the competence of the new teacher. She was an adventurer nicknamed Lightning Step, Zidar. Most of those present were pleased with this news. The name spoke for itself. Only Joseph looked unimpressed, not understanding why the director had chosen her. The reason for this reaction was simple. Zedar was his aunt. The memories he had were not pleasant. She was constantly nagging and reproaching him. The director shrugged. He didn't care about the relationship. The main thing was that she was the best in her field. Soon it was time for classes, and the new professor was already waiting for the students, with a very stern expression on her face. The students began to gather, anticipating the start of the course. The aristocrats were especially happy. Horse riding was considered a mandatory skill for people of their circle. Lihan was counting on a calm lesson. Most of them already had experience in the saddle. But suddenly, a huge eagle appeared in the sky and screamed piercingly, frightening the students. As he approached, the students tried to run away in panic. Gabriel was the first to come into the eagle's field of vision, and the predator rushed in pursuit. He succeeded. He grabbed the prince with his claws and soared into the sky, carrying him away. The vision was terrifying, and although the disciples wanted to help, they could do nothing. Lihan ordered everyone to duck and not move, so as not to attract attention. The students immediately obeyed, falling to their knees. Lihan himself was no longer surprised by such things, and the eagle continued to circle above them. While the young man was wondering where this bird came from, shouts about the weak defense of the academy came from the crowd. One student tried to calm the screaming girl down, but she wouldn't shut up. Suddenly the eagle appeared above them. The noise attracted it. A moment later, a clawed paw grabbed the young man who was trying to calm her down, and the eagle took off with a new victim. There were now two people hanging out in the sky, and Lihan angrily noted to himself, "This is why he asked for silence." However, it seemed strange that the bird itself did not touch the screamer. Suddenly, an idea struck Lihan. He raised his gaze to the sky, peering at the silhouette. Both victims had brightly colored hair, making it clear that this was the bait. Then Lihan told the students to put hoods or robes over their heads to dull the shine of their hair that attracted the eagle. Suddenly a voice was heard. Someone was admiring Lihan, noting how confidently he gave orders and made decisions. Lihan turned around to look for the speaker and noticed the girl from the White Tiger Tower. She was just about to introduce herself when one of the students loudly called for everyone to pay attention to her. Suspicions arose immediately. The students decided that the tigers were again plotting something against Lihan. From all sides, cries came pouring in that now was not the time to sit idly by, while the girl tried in vain to explain that she had not come with a threat. Then the princess stood in front of her, shielding her, and declaring that she trusted this girl. The princess's words instantly calmed the crowd. If Her Highness had confidence in her, then the girl really deserved trust. Lihan assumed that they knew each other. The girl introduced herself without delay. She was a knight in the service of the princess, and her name was Rowan. This surprised Lihan a little, since students were strictly forbidden from bringing guards and servants into the academy. However, it quickly became clear that the ban was about status, not substance. No one was stopping the knight from being brought in as a student. The thought of this made me feel sympathy for Gabriel, despite his belonging to the imperial family. Rowan approached with a request. The bird, although it had slowed down, still posed a danger, and it was unclear how it would behave next. She asked Lihan to take charge and help stop the creature. At first, Lihan didn't understand why he had to do this. But before he could finish speaking, the students supported the idea. They believed in his abilities. He knew he shouldn't agree because leadership always brings problems. However, the confidence with which they looked only at him left no choice. Although reluctantly, he began to make a plan. A few days before, Rowan had learned that it was not the princess who was in charge of the Blue Dragon Tower, but Vardana's. This came as a blow, since the princess had possessed the qualities of a true leader since childhood. Rowan decided to find out what caused this change. That was her plan. Now she was trying to understand what Lihan's secret was. She didn't believe that treats alone could win the students' trust. Meanwhile, Lihan shared the plan with the students gathered around him. He decided to test one guess and looked for something shiny. Luckily, Rowan had a small mirror, which she handed to him. Lihan pointed it at the sun, hoping to attract the bird's attention. It worked. The creature noticed the glint and rushed towards it. He ordered the students to act, and although they were trembling with fear, they built a living wall. Lihan himself hid behind her, waiting for her to approach. When the bird flew very close, he jumped out and cast a light spell. It went off right in front of her beak. A bright flash blinded the bird. It closed its eyes and stopped. Then she turned around and soared into the sky, moving away. The victory was won. The students couldn't stop raving about Lihan. Even the tigers were impressed. Although Lihan was embarrassed, he was more concerned about the question. Where did the students who were captured by the bird earlier disappear to? Suddenly they fell from the sky, straight into the arms of their comrades. Lihan followed the bird with his gaze. It flew up to the tree on which the figure stood. The man in the tree stroked the bird, and it became quiet. And then he jumped down, landing in front of the assembled crowd. The students were shocked. Both the personality and the height of the jump were unexpected. Lihan immediately understood who it was. He recognized the girl as a relative of Professor Joseph, and even found a resemblance. Before he could think that he shouldn't judge her by her kinship, she came up to him and, with a crazy gleam in her eyes, told him about his incredible potential. This look was familiar to him. The professor had looked exactly the same after his first alchemy lesson. Li Han was immediately overcome by a feeling of unpleasant déjà vu. None of the students could believe that this woman was really a professor. Li Han immediately decided to find out. Is everything really as it seems? His observation did not go unnoticed. Zedar confirmed his guess with a smile, calling herself Professor Joseph's aunt. While Li Han was thinking about how not to attract attention to himself, the other students began vying with each other to praise him in front of Zedar, assuring him that he was the best student in the course. Despite Li Han's attempts to stop them, the storytellers clearly captured the professor's interest. Realizing that he couldn't escape, Li Han decided to at least make a decent impression. Zedar introduced herself as the new teacher and announced that the previous one had gone on a mission, a statement that left the students shocked. However, it was not the absence of the old professor that shocked them, but the personality of Zedar. They immediately began to remember her most famous exploits. Li Han noted with surprise that the disappearance of the mentor did not seem to bother anyone. Meanwhile, Zedar called to her the very eagle that had almost torn the students apart a minute ago. It turned out to be a thunderbird, a bird of terrifying size with the gift of controlling lightning and thunder. While Li Han was wondering how safe it was, the stunned prince realized with horror that it was she who had caught him. The students suggested that the bird would become part of the horse-riding curriculum, but the professor just laughed and said, "They won't be able to saddle her even in 10 years. She challenged Li Han to guess what the purpose of her appearance was. He suggested that she was testing the students' reactions to danger. Rowan expressed doubt. After all, it was about horse-riding lessons, and the reason had to be there. But it was Li Han who turned out to be right. The professor smiled and thought that now she understood why her nephew admired him so much. It is unknown what threats the students will face in the future, but Zedar assured that they will be learning horseback riding this semester. She suggested going to the stables, hinting to Li Han in passing that from now on he would help her in everything. After all, the basis of horse riding is horses. Whoever can't handle them, much less can they handle more dangerous creatures. The professor explained that choosing and taming a horse was a mandatory step, but the students seemed to no longer be listening to her. Li Han guessed why they were bored. Each of them already had experience in horse riding. Suddenly the professor stopped and looked at Li Han with a mysterious smile. He felt that something strange was about to happen, or even crazy. In anticipation of a difficult task, Li Han asked Yona, who was walking next to him, to be especially careful. When they reached the stables, the students were delighted. There were real giants among the horses standing in the stalls. Their appearance was mesmerizing, but the main thing was that they were purebred horses with excellent characteristics. To determine the order of choice, the professor asked the students to draw lots. Gabriel had the first choice. The prince was delighted with his success, while the others were surprised. Why was he so lucky? Without thinking, Gabriel headed to the stall and chose the most formidable of all the horses. He was sure that a good horse must be strong and have an impressive appearance. The prince was pleased that the horse leaned towards him, but instead of caressing him, he hit him with his muzzle. Yona and Li Han just watched in silence as Gabriel fell to the ground from the powerful blow. They approached him only when they were sure that he was no longer moving. Soon, laughter began to be heard. Someone noted that they shouldn't have chosen such an aggressive animal. One of the students, who had already chosen a horse, said that he preferred affectionate and kind animals. However, appearances were deceiving. His horse suddenly lunged and grabbed his head, not intending to let go. Seeing this, the White Tiger student also decided to tease his Blue Dragon colleagues. But not a single horse treated him kindly. One butted him, another snorted in his face. The students were shocked. There was not a single normal horse in the stable. Even Li Han began to wonder why all the horses were acting so aggressively. The professor just laughed loudly and reminded them that they were there to learn horse riding. And the first task was a simple but important test: learning to find a common language with a horse. The professor's joy clearly did not arouse enthusiasm among the students. She explained that horses would only be kind to those who showed genuine love. Li Han suspected a trick and decided to choose the most affectionate-looking one. But before he could take a step, the professor intercepted him and ordered him to follow her. Li Han's thoughts were far from rosy, but he had no choice. The woman led him to a stall with a snow-white horse. The professor considered an ordinary horse unworthy and chose this one for him. Some of the students were delighted. Others were outraged by the injustice. The professor clarified, although the horse is strong, it has a difficult character, aggressive and capricious. Li Han was not surprised. He thought so, but he understood that the task was not easy. But the prospect of receiving a reward aroused interest. The professor had no doubt that if he had dealt with the Thunderbird, he could deal with this too. When Joseph opened the door of the hut, he did not expect to see his aunt. And it turned out that she came not alone, but with Li Han. Without waiting for an invitation, the aunt walked past her nephew and moved to inspect the dwelling. Joseph looked questioningly at Li Han, who explained guiltily, she insisted that he bring her. Having begun the inspection, Zedar immediately began to reproach her nephew for the dust and loneliness. Without pause, she launched into a speech about how it was high time for Joseph to find a life partner. The nephew tried to change the subject to lunch, winking desperately at Li Han. Li Han caught the hint and quickly declared that he was dying of hunger. The trick worked. Attention immediately switched to him. Zedar told Joseph to stay with Li Han. She was cooking today. Any attempt to object was immediately cut off by a stern look. Joseph groaned inwardly, his worst fears confirmed. But his gaze caught on something under Li Han's robe, and this made him wary. Li Han calmly took out his staff and unfolded it to its full size. The professor noted with interest not only the new staff, but also the spirit of the forest emanating from it. The question of where he got it from was a bit confusing, but Li Han got out of it by making up a story about coincidences. Neither Joseph nor Zedar believed a single word. The escape was obvious. Joseph decided to check whether the tree was asking a riddle. He explained that the spirit was well known, wise, though tedious. Li Han had the feeling that this was about something rare and secret, which meant that the staff could be special. In his mind, he was already imagining invisibility, mana absorption, and other miracles. Meanwhile, Zedar finished cooking, put the food on the table, and remarked, the staff would definitely come in handy for something. That something turned out to be agriculture. An image immediately appeared in Li Han's head. He was digging the ground with a staff. He was upset, but Joseph hastened to explain that he reveals himself in a special way when caring for nature. And he reminded me of the garden beds that Li Han himself had once mentioned. Upon hearing about farming, Zedar enthusiastically offered her help. After a hearty lunch, they went out into the field. Zedar helped with the plantings. Although potatoes and sweet potatoes take a long time to ripen, she believed that the harvest would be useful. Li Han was not discouraged. If the staff could help with this, it would be good. Suddenly Zedar called him over, and as soon as Li Han moved away from the newly planted sprout, it began to grow. The morning at the Blue Dragon Tower greeted the students with unbearable hunger. Suddenly, Li Han entered the room, holding a basket of food. Inside were fresh vegetables and even a piece of aromatic cheese. Seeing the supplies, the students perked up. They finally had food. As it turned out, this was a token of gratitude from Professor Zedar. Out of hunger, the students behaved like chicks waiting for their mother to bring them food. Li Han, understanding their condition, still asked them to wait. He was going to cook. The students watched the process with greedy interest, barely holding back their saliva. Yona even compared him to an alchemist immersed in a magical process. After trying the soup, Li Han ordered everyone to bring plates. The students immediately rushed to carry out the order. While he was pouring the soup, Yona was recording the portions and the profit. Everyone was happy that they would finally eat. One of the students called Lihan over and wanted to ask him for something. Lihan walked towards the right room and knocked carefully. The princess opened the door, looking in surprise at why he had come to her. Lihan handed her a bowl of soup, informing her that everyone had already eaten. Adele tasted the dish cautiously. The taste seemed incredibly rich to her. She hadn't eaten anything like it for a long time. Lihan was worried that she was probably hungry too, but he didn't insist that she join the others. The princess thanked him and promised to repay him somehow. Returning to the lounge, Lihan saw the students eagerly waiting for him. Hearing that the princess liked the food, they calmed down noticeably. They offered to let Lihan continue to bring food to Adele, promising to pay him double. He liked the idea and readily agreed. The students' concern for the princess touched him, and their approval reassured him. It was approaching time for evening classes with Professor Greg. He, however, was only thinking about the fact that his contract obliged him to teach, and not to coddle students. But Lihan's huge mana reserves did not allow the professor to simply let him go. He knew that letting such a student go would mean bitter regret later. Greg's sudden question caught Lihan off guard. Had he noticed that he had been slacking off? However, the professor merely asked what the purpose of his training was. He was surprised that Lihan had not read the notes, but he himself had suggested asking questions. Then Lihan reformulated. He wanted to understand how the exercise would be useful in a real fight. The professor fell silent, choosing an answer. The question seemed too banal to him. In the end, he decided to demonstrate it visually. He stood up and declared that he could kill him with an ordinary pen. The example sounded frightening, but Lihan did not interrupt. Greg explained, "The goal of the fight is to win, but training strengthens the magical power. The same projectile in the hands of different mages can have different destructive power. Under the pressure of a real battle, it is extremely difficult to use such power. But a magician with a well-honed base will be able to cope even in a critical situation." The professor fired a projectile, which began to ricochet off the walls, forcing Lihan to dodge. There was an explosion, but nothing was damaged. Perhaps a combination of two spells was used. The professor walked up to Lihan and placed his hand on his shoulder. Even after such a powerful spell, he didn't look tired. While the professor was returning to his place, Lihan was thinking, "This man is not as simple as he seemed at first." At first it was thought that he was lazy and avoiding exercise, but it turned out that every exercise made sense. Lihan decided to ask one more question. He said that he had mastered low-level control, but still had difficulty maintaining full control over objects. The professor immediately grasped the essence. Lihan had much more mana than the others. This surprised the student. Hope immediately arose that the professor might be able to help cope with the excess power. The professor came up to him, took his hand, and cast a mana diversion spell. The place of contact was enveloped in dark smoke, and a purple glow danced in the air. The magic was strong, high rank, but soft. It drained mana. Lihan recognized the spell and became wary. The teacher used something similar on students with frightening ease. The attempt to stop was unsuccessful. The professor only ordered to stand still. Suddenly, he was overcome by a feeling familiar to Garcia, as if he found himself on a boundless sea of mana. A second later, the professor collapsed to the floor, and this shocked Lihan. He leaned over to help, but Greg stood up himself and stopped him with a gesture. He explained, he tried to reduce the amount of mana, but did not expect such a high level. If the magician cannot cope with the flow of energy, the body faints. And this is exactly what happened to him. Lihan knew about this, and it was all the more surprising that the experienced magician lost consciousness, miscalculating his strength. It seemed there was no hope. Even this didn't help. But Greg assured there was still a chance. He asked if Lihan had used low-level control at the time. He immediately realized his mistake and honestly confessed. The professor pointed out that control comes from the magician's instinct, which means that control was not lost. Lihan remembered pointing the pen at the director. Perhaps that was his will. The advice was simple: trust your instincts, and control will increase over time. The joy of the decision made was strengthened. The trust in the professor turned out to be not in vain. Greg pulled out the sphere and asked an unexpected question about readiness. Lihan was confused by this. It was unclear what preparations were being made for. The professor said he was going to aim at his jaw, and the task was to defend himself using control. Lihan tried to object, but the attack had already begun. The first sphere flew past his face. He managed to dodge. Bruised and exhausted, Lihan sat on the floor while the professor praised him for his understanding of the basics of control. Irritation was evident in my thoughts. I had once again trusted someone I shouldn't have. The professor picked it up and said that the solution to the problem came from Lihan himself. But there was only one thought in my head. If I hadn't done this, I could have died. Greg held out an iron ball, ordering him to use control. Without delay, Lihan performed the spell. The ball moved at his command, precisely, obediently. The professor suggested using it for training instead of the star stone. But Lihan felt that he was not finished with the stone yet. The perfect circle still had not been created. The professor simply suggested trying, and the task suddenly seemed easier than before. He explained, "The star stone is for those who find magic difficult, but Lihan is no longer one of them." Now the task became drawing a circle with an iron ball, and later a new task would appear. This outcome was not at all pleasing. I wanted to relax and easily get a grade. The professor reflected. There are two types of people in the world. Some freeze in the face of danger, while others act instantly, trying to eliminate the threat. And Lihan clearly belonged to the second group, with the potential to become a battle mage. Lihan found Ding. Fortunately, she didn't have to wait long. The girl just shook her head, but immediately noticed how exhausted he was. After a grueling lesson with Professor Greg, Lihan looked exhausted, but he simply brushed off her worries. In response to his previous request, Ding brought him a priest's robe. In return, he handed her a pie, but the girl immediately hastened to refuse. She explained that pressing was suffering right now, and it would be unfair for her to enjoy delicious food. Lihan remembered Mary and realized that the task ahead would not be easy. Tink asked to give the pie to someone who needed it more. She said, would only need a cup of tea. Lihan readily offered to make tea, explaining that he was interested in different types of tea. He heard somewhere that priests prefer bitter drinks, green tea or coffee. That's why he thought that this was exactly the taste that Ding was expecting. But instead of ordinary tea, he decided to prepare something more. A real culinary masterpiece. Seeing what he was doing, the girl jumped up and reminded him that he had just promised tea. Lihan turned around with the most innocent look and said that he was cooking according to a family recipe. She noticed that he added too much sugar, but he only looked at her resentfully. Realizing that she didn't want to upset him, Ding decided to give it a try. Lihan placed a cup of aromatic drink in front of her and invited her to take a sip. She hesitated whether to take the risk, but eventually decided to do it. The tea turned out to be unexpectedly tasty. The girl even involuntarily licked her lips. It was sweet and slightly spicy, revealing a whole palette of flavors. Lihan was pleased. His trick had worked. He was already preparing for a new portion. This time he mixed sugar, nuts, cocoa, and milk, achieving a taste reminiscent of boiled corn. In front of the girl was a drink that looked more like soup. Lihan even handed her a spoon. She honestly admitted that it was more like soup, but seeing his offended face, she tried it anyway. While she was eating this strange tea soup, Lihan was glad that she liked it. Now he was determined to feed her with his teas. Having finished, the girl thanked him for the treat. Lihan came up from behind and quietly added that he would now wait for her here at the agreed time. Meanwhile, Evening came and the students began to return to their rooms. Although they were supposed to be in their bedrooms at this time, Li-han decided to test how well his plan would work. He dressed himself in a priest's robe, pretending to be heading to evening prayers. Having reached the academy, he slowly walked along its spacious corridors, looking for a way to the exit. While exploring the area, he suddenly came across someone's figure. At first he thought it was a teacher, but upon closer inspection he recognized a student from the Black Turtle Tower. Li-han decided to follow him and noticed that he moved completely silently. It was obvious that the guy had been training. Considering that mouse beastmen were viewed with suspicion, everything was starting to make sense. They were usually considered thieves, and although Li-han didn't want to give in to stereotypes, this young man's intentions seemed very obvious. He approached and told the stranger not to make a sound, although he did not intend to harm him. The boy immediately became frightened, realizing that he had been caught, which meant that punishment could not be avoided. While he was coming to his senses, Li-han apologized for his harshness, which was caused only by caution. The guy's name was Ren. He turned out to be a thief from the White Crow organization. He had no friends. Most tried to keep their distance. He hoped that by obtaining the necessary things for the academy, he would be able to win the favor of his peers. One day he was lucky. He came across a door, which he thought was the entrance to the storage facility. With his skills, he easily created a fake key to get inside. Li-han praised him. The fake was indeed of high quality. Ren asked where Li-han was from, since his physique resembled that of a Tiger Tower disciple. But as soon as Li-han mentioned his last name, his interlocutor froze, shocked to the depths of his soul. Trying to calm him down, Li-han suggested that they unite and act together. This struck Ren as a shock. Aristocrats usually ignored people like him. Li-han only reminded that it was he who first proposed cooperation, and hurried his friend. There was little time. He asked if Ren could open the door, but he doubted it. The lock was protected by magic. While Ren was fiddling with the mechanism, Li-han noticed a familiar symbol and ordered him to step back. He took out the key and opened the door with ease, leaving Ren completely confused. When asked where he got the key, Li-han replied that he borrowed it from the director's drawer. Li-han decided not to reveal the true origin of the key, a message from the director, for now, since he himself did not expect that it would be useful. While Ren was pondering how all this was possible, a suspicion was already growing in Li-han's head. There was something more than just a warehouse waiting for them behind the door. There really was a staircase behind the door leading down. When Li-han suggested moving forward, Ren suddenly became alert. He heard something. He sat down, put his ear to the floor, and listened more closely. Voices could be heard from below, which only fueled Li-han's interest. He was always wondering how things were delivered to the academy. Perhaps this was the hidden path. Li-han assumed that all the supplies were stored below and suggested going down. Ren hesitated. The idea seemed risky. They took only a few steps down, but the darkness swallowed everything. They couldn't even see their own hand. Ren suggested a light spell, but Li-han stopped him in time. He reminded that if the director himself was hiding this place, then it was easy to get lost here. Ren was amazed by such cold-blooded calculation. It seemed that this was not the first time that Li-han had found himself in such a situation. I remembered the rumors that even the prince and princess were afraid to breathe once more near him, and that he once subdued Thunderbird with just one spell. The thought that these rumors were not fiction was alarming. While Ren was deep in thought, they reached the lower level. As expected, there was a storage facility in front of them. They began to move forward cautiously. But as soon as I stepped into the corridor, the lamps instantly flared up, illuminating the space with a bright flame. The boys quickly took cover, not understanding why the lamps suddenly flared up. Suddenly, Li-han heard approaching footsteps, and soon a figure appeared in the darkness. He assumed it was the warehouse keeper. He slowly counted the supplies neatly stacked on the shelves. Li Han didn't notice how the keeper approached from behind. He was clearly interested in who these uninvited guests were. Li Han turned sharply, intending to blind the stranger and run away. But this plan didn't work. The keeper's entire body was tightly wrapped in bandages, and he might not have had an eye at all. When one sense disappears, the others become more acute to make up for the loss. However, Li Han could not understand how he had figured them out. There was no sound, and the smell was mixed with the aromas of food. They had no idea that the keeper might be able to see mana. Li Han's mana especially caught his attention. It glowed too brightly. Without thinking, the keeper checked the source, and at that very moment found himself in a seething sea. He immediately bowed and apologized, mistaking Li Han for the director himself. This slightly confused Li Han. The keeper silently turned around and left without saying a word. Li Han wondered, could such a mistake really have happened? While Ren was trying to figure out what happened, Li Han realized that they were discovered because of the mana. He reassured his friend that everything was settled and suggested not to touch the food, since it was being strictly accounted for. Instead, he suggested finding a way for the products to be delivered. Ren listened and rushed towards where the footsteps were coming from. They ran down the corridor, Ren showing the way, and Li Han amazed at how quickly he got used to the unfamiliar place. Li Han asked Ren why he had been so nervous before, but Ren waved him off, asking him not to get into his head. Finally, they reached the place. A dead end loomed before them. Ren began to worry. He was sure that he was going the right way. But Li Han noticed a protruding stone. Everything pointed to a secret door. Unlike Ren, who lived a life of thievery since childhood, Li Han read a lot of books. Thanks to this, his imagination and ingenuity worked much better. He pressed on the stone and the hidden door opened. A long corridor stretched behind her. Ren didn't understand how Li Han had guessed about the cache. Perhaps it had something to do with its origin. Vardhanas. Li Han thought about only one thing. He was pleased with the thought of his long-awaited escape. He recalled the suffering he had gone through to get to this point. The academy staff had strict rules. They were forbidden to discuss what they saw, engage in conversations, or ask questions. That's why they didn't react in any way to the students who suddenly appeared in the passage. This amazed the boys. Ren even thought that they were not seen. Li Han did not hide. He approached one of the carters. He asked him to give them a ride, and he readily agreed, noting that the work was almost finished. The carriage set off, and the friends began to calm down. It seemed that all the troubles were behind them. However, one thought did not leave Li Han. It was Ren's admiration. The servants were still silent, and Li Han was thinking about how harsh this world was. The academy was a symbol of magic in the empire and had political significance. Li Han assumed that the workers had most likely been warned of possible enemies and told to be on guard. Suddenly the cart stopped, and Li Han asked the reason. However, what he saw left him amazed and confused. Li Han noticed Professor Garcia checking the carts. He understood that she had not yet noticed their presence. However, Ren was noticeably nervous. He didn't like the professor being nearby. He expressed doubt and decided to just watch for now. Garcia was holding some kind of bag on her lap. When she opened it, pinkish smoke came out. It was an artifact, a commission from the director, to deliver it to the families of the Imperial Circle. The professor sat opposite two warriors whose task, apparently, was to guard the carts. But even her slight smile made them tremble. Suddenly, the warrior with the rabbit ears jumped up and ordered his comrade to also draw his sword. Garcia was surprised. Were they really that afraid of her? However, the knight hastened to explain. It was not about her. He heard an alarming sound. Something had happened. Two men in cloaks came out to the carts. They introduced themselves as traders, but their faces were completely covered with bandages. The knight immediately noticed the weapon behind the back of one of them and did not believe this hastily concocted lie. One of the strangers threw off his cloak and pulled out a weapon. The head of the guard gave the order to hold the defense. The soldiers lined up and aimed their crossbows. On command, they opened fire. But the arrows did not reach their target. The attackers were protected by the artifact. When asked who they were, the strangers did not answer. They hated that the carts were carrying goods for the mages, those who, in their opinion, were ruining the empire. They considered the academy a corrupt place. The guards realized that they were facing anti-magicians, people who despise magic. The anti-mages went on the offensive, intending to kill everyone in the caravan. But suddenly everyone was covered by a protective barrier. Without having time to react, the anti-magicians crashed into the shield and collapsed. The spell was cast by Garcia, and the warriors were glad that she was with them that day. But she also understood that the situation remained critical. She was not a battle mage, and could not hold off the enemies for long. Garcia created a flock of magical birds that soared into the sky. It was a call for help. She hoped she could hold out until someone responded. The anti-magicians took out a sphere covered in glowing patterns. The sphere began to absorb the barrier's magic. Garcia didn't expect this. She was truly surprised by what was happening. Even her own mana was going into the artifact, and she was getting weaker with each passing second. When the knight asked what was happening, she replied, "The enemies possess a relic that can neutralize spells." Such objects were considered ancient, and could suppress magic over a large area. This amazed the knight. Relics were rare. Where did the anti-magicians get one? While Garcia was thinking, an anti-mage snuck up behind her. She didn't notice how he straightened up, but suddenly he lost consciousness before he could cause any harm. Neither the knight nor Garcia herself understood what had happened. However, behind this was Lihan, sneaking up invisibly under the cover of invisibility.